Good evening. This workshop with the Socorro ISD Board of Trustees will come to order, please. The date is Wednesday, January 7th, 2026. It's our first meeting of 2026. And the time is
5:31.
5:31 p.m. We do have a quorum. Thank you for joining us for this meeting, both in person and online via our YouTube stream. The full recording of the meeting will be available on YouTube and archived through the board website, where viewers have the option of watching the meeting with closed captions translated in multiple languages. Gracias por acompañarnos en esta reunión, tanto en persona como en línea a través de nuestra transmisión de YouTube. La grabación completa de la reunión estará disponible en YouTube y se archivará a través del sitio web de la Junta, donde los espectadores tienen la opción de ver la reunión con subtítulos traducidos a varios idiomas. Please, let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Continuing with our agenda, we didn't have any speakers sign up for public comment, so we will continue with the board workshop. And of course, our LSG coach is Mr. Ben Mackey.
All right, good evening, y'all.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's great to be here with you. Start the year off right in Socorro ISD. Thank you for spending your first board meeting with me. That's great. We have 4 items today, and they are truly work items. So we're going to have a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion back and forth. Would love to hear the discussions on each of these. I'll be facilitating and just taking a whole bunch of notes on this as we walk through them. And then the exciting thing about where you all are at the process, back in December, you all approved your priorities for the district. You adopted your goals, your constraints. You identified what your progress measures are. The administration laid out exactly over each of the next 5 years what they're trying to achieve in all things ranging from 3rd grade reading to 8th grade algebra math to healthcare sustainability. And that is what you all as a board have said collectively is that's our priorities. And so now essentially everything else we do is simply about aligning what you do to achieving those priorities so you can show your community exactly what you're accomplishing in that work. So we'll do a lot less new things and a lot more just like continuing to deepen the work that you all have already done. So we got 4 things tonight. Some of them are much quicker than the one I expect us to spend the most time on is board operating procedures. You, a few months ago, received board operating procedures with a bunch of notes from me. You might have slept since you read those last. I'll be walking you through each of those areas and asking you questions. Would love a conversation about it. So that one will be probably where we spend the most time. But I just want to touch on some of these other areas that usually at this point, once a board adopts its priorities, there are some other meaningful systems to align. And so that is the district vision that we'll talk about, superintendent evaluation process, board operating procedures, and then we'll finish up with a brief discussion around, now that you have priorities, what does it look like to evaluate progress towards them monthly? Any questions before we begin? All right. Then let's start with the district vision. Real quick, does anyone know the district vision off the top of your head? It is tomorrow's leaders learning today in Socorro ISD.
It's literally faceless.
The question that inevitably comes up, and it's just a good practice, is as you go through, you all went through an extensive community listening process. You heard about what your community wanted. You took all of that. You put it into actionable goals and priorities. The question that inevitably you should just consider, not necessarily to do anything about, is, does the vision we have written down still match what we're trying to accomplish? And the question that I just want to open up for you all is, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, maybe there are adjustments, is I would just like to open up an open question to the board is, do we want to, over the next 3, 6, 9 months, think about if our vision or mission, we would want to consider any updates to it based on what we've learned since we set these priorities and over the last year? The answer to that question might be yes. The answer to that question might be no. It's just an open question that I'd love to start with, but it's always important when you set priorities, you should also make sure that your vision still reflects what you're aiming to accomplish with your district. So with that, I'll just open it up and see what people's thoughts and reactions are to that. Hit you off with a real question to start the night.
personally, I think it's open enough to where everything that we build falls within it. And just with the question that you asked, do you know what your vision is? So that means that we have a stellar job of truly teaching that, because truly, we should all know that. Everything that we do should be leading towards tomorrow's leaders learning today. So personally, I feel that that's still overarching enough that truly it encompasses what SISD is about, and that everything that we build falls under there. So those are my 2 cents.
Great, thank you so much.
If I can chime in, it's my understanding that the vision has been this for years, if not decades, and I think it's withstood the test of time. I think it ties us back to our roots and where we are, but where we still want to continue to head. But those are just my thoughts.
Thank you, Superintendent.
So I think from an organizational perspective, right, the vision should be strategic and forward-thinking enough that it shouldn't change very often. And I think it's short enough to remember. It's broad enough to be all-encompassing, but it still gets after the heart of what it is we're here for. As we get lower down the totem pole and we start talking about the mission statement, right, that in theory should only be a couple of sentences long, easy to remember, but that should be able to change every 3, 5, 7 years, depending on the environment and the culture that we're cultivating. So sticking to the topic of vision, I think we're good. Like I don't want to say content because it sounds kind of status quo, but I think it fits. I don't think there's a need to change just for the sake of change.
I think it's.
And I will, real quick, Paul, before we go there, just to norm everyone, the mission, as written, is the mission of Socorro Independent School District is to optimize each student's academic, artistic, athletic, career, and interpersonal opportunities.
I think Maribel hit it the best, and I think, like Ryan said, it's straight and to the point. Ms. Nakara, when she was board president, she put these back there, so when we sit up to the dais, when we sit there, we can actually see our vision and know why we're up there for. These are tomorrow's leaders learning today. I think it's straight and to the point.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I think it's very applicable to what we do and to what we're doing. I think the vision ties back to what is important, student outcomes. And like Paul said, a reminder of why is it that we're sitting here, trying to help the district move forward, to help our students, move forward, to progress into leaders.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
No, I agree with my colleagues. I think it's short, it's concise, and it's to the point. And I appreciate the verbiage. And I'm wondering, how long have we had it? I know you said maybe decades.
Yeah. I want to say it goes back from, somebody shared with me, maybe like to the 90s.
Oh, wow.
Was as far back as they could remember having the same one.
Maybe as long as
when
as we
started.
started working in
Yeah.
Socorro. Yes. Okay. No, but I don't see the need to change it.
All right, it sounds pretty overwhelming that we feel good about our vision statement, and it still captures what our community wants, what we want for the students and families across Socorro ISD. It's just a helpful exercise as you set priorities to make sure everything still fits. And so I think, to Ryan, your point, the vision is the broad part. Tomorrow's leaders learning today. The mission says how we're going to accomplish that. We're going to make sure to optimize students' academic, artistic, athletic, career, and interpersonal opportunities. And then the priorities that you adopted last month are, how do we know we're accomplishing that? Those are the next steps to accomplishing those items. And what you're essentially saying to your community is, we feel that we are actually optimizing our students' academic, artistic, athletic, career, and interpersonal opportunities by ensuring that they can read on level, that they do math by 8th grade, that they're ready for career, college, military through the metrics we've identified, that we're keeping our district sustainable financially and through the healthcare system, and that we're making sure we take into account our community satisfaction, parents, students, and community. So with that, it sounds pretty, we're good on that. We believe the vision is in a good place, so great. We will move on then to the second part. So again, you have these priorities. You have your vision, you have your mission, and now you have your priorities that are going to tell you if you are on track to achieving your system's goals over the course of the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So everything else we'll do is looking at processes and procedures that can help you align the work you're doing to achieving those priorities. The first thing is obviously you have hired a superintendent to achieve the goals. You've now said, superintendent, we hired you. Congratulations, superintendent. And now we have given you the goals and the priorities we want you to accomplish. We want you to make sure third grade reading is on point, third grade math, eighth grade algebra, college career military readiness. And you need to make sure that we are financially sustainable, that we have a health care plan that's sustainable, and we also have strong community engagement and feedback. So the question now is, how do you design a system that makes sure the superintendent is incentivized to do those things and make sure their focus is there? And it's not because Superintendent Vasquez wouldn't want to do those things. No, every superintendent wants to be successful. But so often what we see is that without clear systems in place, boards ask about a lot of other things too, because they come up and they're meaningful, et cetera. But if a board doesn't come around a system about how we're going to evaluate the superintendent, then implicitly what a board is doing is saying, we're going to evaluate you based on whatever the last thing was I told you and what I want you to do. And so how can you create a structure that makes sure that what's in the front of his mind is the priorities that you set, and you do that through your evaluation process? And so I would love to have an open conversation around, not the evaluation for this year, anything like that. Y'all are kind of moving forward with that. But going forward into next year and beyond, what kind of process would you want to do to align your superintendent, what you're judging your superintendent on, with achieving the priorities that you have set? And so for this, you should have a very small printed sheet of examples of what this looked like. I'm going to ask you to be on the one that has goals on the right-hand side and constraints on the left-hand side. So there's another one with like some orange, yellow filled in. You can ignore that one. This would be an example of what it would look like for Socorro ISD if you just took what LSG uses as a standard. You are not required to do that. You can do what you want to do. But essentially, the heart of LSG, and frankly, most organizational management, is if you have priorities, you should judge your superintendent or leader on achieving your priorities. This goes to the business world also. If a for-profit industry says your goal is to meet this kind of sales, generally they judge their leader on achieving that benchmark of sales or accomplishing something else that they're doing. And so the starting place that I would love to engage this around, the overall question is, how do you want to make sure that your superintendent is focused on your priorities long-term through the evaluation process? An example, and this is just an example for you to consider and work from or think about or change entirely, would be now that you have goals and progress measures and you have targets for what to accomplish each year, the first thing to do would be judge your superintendent based on whether or not they accomplished those targets this year. So I had pulled out exactly what was written from your adopted priorities. So for each of the goals, we adopted as a board, the superintendent should focus on early literacy and improving our third grade students that score meets from 58% to 63% over the next 5 years. And you said this year we should move that up from 58% to 59%. And so that's why it says we started this year at 58%. By the end of this year, we should be at 59%. We should hold the superintendent and look at the end of the year. Did we meet that, yes or no? And do that for each of your goals and or your progress measures. Same thing on the constraint side. So you also told your superintendent, we care about financial responsibility. And the 3 ways we're measuring it are improving unassigned fund balance, year-end operating results regarding deficit, and the first accountability rating. And you said, this first year, we had an unassigned fund balance of 29 days. We can't go below that. We got to keep 29 days at minimum. It's going to take us some time to build it more. So you would be judging, did we start at 29 days and did we stay at 29 days by the end of the year? We didn't get any worse off. For the district operating results on deficit, going from a $9.4 million deficit to a $0 deficit in this next year. And then same thing with your first rating, going from a 66D, which was your current on the first rating, up to a 74C on the first rating by the end of this year. So basically taking what you have identified and saying that's what the goal is, and actually putting it into a form where the superintendent can know and point to, that's what I need to accomplish this year. And when other things come up, you will inevitably raise other concerns or have other discussions, but having an evaluation system that levers your priorities, first and foremost, will allow the superintendent the ability to say, you know what, yes, other things are important also, but this is my number one priority because that's what the board set. So this is one option. I would just love to open the conversation up to this board, and superintendent, please feel free to weigh in also in terms of what will help you most productively accomplish the priorities. As what do you want that superintendent evaluation process to look like? Nothing here is guaranteed that if you don't meet it, you're fired, or you meet it, you get a raise or whatnot. All of that's governed by your contract and your own discussions. This is really just supposed to be a tool about are we accomplishing our priorities or not, and using that as the foundation for any conversation. So with that, I will pause and would love anyone's thoughts, feedback, ideas, discussions.
So I appreciate the framework. It gives us some very clear text that's easy to read and understand. It gives us some very clear data points on where we're at, where we want to be. But I don't want to get lost in the data. I would like to still take into account some of the humanity side of it. If we just focus on data, then everything else gets pushed to the side, and we may lose some of the interpersonal, some of that human capital perspective. And I don't want to lose or abuse our human capital because we're focused on numbers. And so if there's a way to integrate that piece in, and maybe it's more subjective than objective, but like it's hard to put a number or a percent on culture. And being able to cultivate the culture and be a culture carrier throughout the organization, I think is important. So I don't know exactly where I'm going with that specifically, but I would like to see something that may not be as tangible, but still as important from a relational perspective.
Great point. I'm going to ask you a few follow-up questions because you do have stakeholder experience and culture written in here as one of your 3 constraints that you will be trying to measure that. The difficult thing for boards is ultimately you are in charge of understanding it at a system level, not anecdotally from what I hear here and there, but like, is it true for the system? So my question for you, I think that makes a lot of sense. As you think about evaluating the superintendent and determining if the superintendent has effectively established and maintained the culture that you're aiming for, what would you want to be looking at to make those determinations? And how will this board make those determinations? Do you have any thoughts on what that could look like or would look like? And you can think about it for a while too.
Yeah, and just with what Mr. Woodcraft shared, I'm of the opinion that I like the quantitative piece because qualitatively, it depends on the day. Today is raining, so if we were evaluating you, possibly good luck because it took us a while to get here. You know, it's very subjective. I personally like the quantitative piece, and if anything, as a board, we could put where it says points possible, we could truly agree with what is most important to us, and that way our superintendent would know very clearly when he's stepping into the formative and to the summative evaluation period, he knows exactly what to bring and discuss with us. And I hear what you're saying is, how could I honor some of the things that are not on here, but I think that's where we could look at to make sure that we do have everything that you're thinking of as far as the climate and the culture, that we can have some type of measurement that we all agree upon of what it is. Because for me, climate and culture might be completely different than what Superintendent Vasquez is building. In that way, it's very clear. This is what I built for climate and culture, and this is what shows if I'm meeting that mark. Do you agree? And we all understand what that mark is. That way, it's not so subjective. So that's just my feedback, that I do like the quantitative piece, and I believe as a team, the to be determined, where it says the points possible, that's where we could come to an understanding of which sections are most important. And it might be every single year we'll come back and adjust what that looks like. So that's just my...
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, you could decide. I mean, you could do, the goals are worth 50% of the points. For each goal, that's 1/4 of 50%, whatever it happens to be. The constraints are also worth 50%. You could also say, the goals are more important. That's 60% for the goals and 30% for the constraints and 10% for something else to be
Yeah.
determined. Maybe it's just like the board gets together and gives an I don't know. That's what you get to design. My only generalized coaching is whatever you say you want it to be, it's the board's responsibility to be as crystal clear as what they mean. Otherwise, what happens is the superintendent goes off and does a lot of work that they're really proud of, and they come back and say, look at how I built the culture. And inevitably, board members go, but that's not what I had in mind. Oh, and I had in mind something else, and then you get into this issue. So that's why I would just push, when whatever you're thinking about from a systems level, be as clear as possible on what are those hallmarks that we're going to look at so we can all be on the same page and create that understanding. But that's a great one. But yeah, that's totally up to this board is, what percentage do we want to focus on the goals? Do we want to reward and identify the superintendents achieve these goals versus other things? It's my recommendation that you set the priorities. The priority should be the majority of it, but sure, it might not be everything. So, other thoughts?
My thinking is I'm aligned with Ms. Macias because exactly what she said. If Mr. Vasquez calls me earlier in the day and tells me we got to do something and it's something I disagree with or feel strongly another direction, I might show up and be in a bad mood or upset with Jim because he's making a tough decision and I don't like it, but it doesn't mean he doesn't have to make it. That's just the way it is. Some days are gonna be rough, right? But then just because I'm in a who basically subjectively the other 364 days of activity and accomplishments and goals and interactions at that point mean nothing because I'm going to fire off on the evaluation because I'm mad at him on that particular day, But just through my own career, I know that what gets measured gets improved. And if what we're saying are that these goals and these constraints are important, then that's what we should be measuring and that's what we should be making sure that he stays focused on. And the way that I know to make sure that whoever focuses on what we're saying important is by putting in the performance evaluation. It's, professionally, it's been the practice. And I know that's what's been the practice with me personally during my performance evaluations. So and it does, it keeps you focused.
Thank you for that. And I would say one of the reasons for the focus, and you all have done a lot of work to identify some really meaningful outcomes for your community, whether it's on the academic side about going from 85 to 93% of students on TCMR readiness, or on the financial side, going from a 66D on your first financial rating to a B in the next 5 years. The recommendation of making sure that you can be making sure to put the outcomes there separates, did you accomplish what winning looked like from how we did it? Because inevitably what happens without that is, all right, if we need to go from a deficit to a surplus budget, there are 100% going to be some tough decisions that have to get made in there. And so if there is not the benefit to focus on the outcome, I inevitably, as a superintendent, get pushed into thinking about, is my board going to be mad at me because I had to make this decision because I'm being evaluated based on how they feel about my performance, as opposed to, did I accomplish what they told me to accomplish? And so it starts to separate out those how from the what we're trying to accomplish. It allows the board to have the conversation. The board's got to understand why we're doing things and how it fits there. But the more you can structure your evaluation to focus on the outcomes, whatever you define the outcomes to be, I'm not even telling you what the outcomes should be. Focus on the outcomes. It allows the superintendent generally more ability to make harder decisions to achieve that outcome that they might be hesitant to because they're worried about what's going to happen if I don't do it. I can't stay to finish the job if I don't keep the job, and so on. So again, that's not a specific conversation about this, but it's just generally what happens in school systems.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking more for making sure that we account for the exception, not the rule.
Yep.
And I know that we've utilized like the football coach analogy previously in some of these meetings. So if the goal is to win the Super Bowl and you have a head coach like Nick Saban who brings in an offensive coordinator, has a terrible year, fires the offensive coordinator, brings in a new one. Well, now you have a new coach with a new system, the same players. And it's hard to build momentum that way when you're switching out personnel. And not to say that Jim would do this, but if we're focused on the numbers and Jim's focused on the numbers and we have a middle school principal that's not meeting them in year one, and he gets rid of that principal and brings in a new one, and it doesn't work and he gets rid of that one and brings in a new one, like, I don't want the culture to be that this is like a butcher mill and we just rotate people through, right? Because the numbers are what's most important. And I know that's going to be the exception, right? We don't get involved in the day-to-day. We don't get involved in personnel issues. Like, I understand that. Onesies and twosies, you're like, yep, makes sense. If it's 30, 40, 50 a year, then maybe we have a different problem we need to look at. And I think that's the part that I was looking at it trying to account for.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, you know, 3.2 staff experience. You know, if we're burning out teachers because we're so focused on data-driven that we can't get after some of these other areas, then that's a concern. And it's just, I just want to make sure that we're able to find that balance. But again, it's hard to quantify feeling, right? It's hard to quantify human capital and sweat equity outside of I'm stressed and I can't do it. So,
Yep. And I think what inevitably happens is this process. You think about evaluation, what I generally see boards do is they might surface something else. They might surface, you know what? One of the other ways that we're looking at it, you know, are we retaining our staff at least as good as the region or something like that? Or we have a much bigger churn year over year over year. And then what that inevitably realizes is, oh, you know, we have all these other constraints, but we don't have anything about retaining effective staff. Maybe we should go back and add a constraint about retention of staff and then put it in there. And because that's supposedly the goals and the constraints should be your priority. So if that's a priority, what I see oftentimes come out of this is we say, those look good, we're going to do most of it on that, but we want to do this other thing too. Then the question is, do you just make it one of your priorities to focus on? So,
well, and this tool gives us the flexibility to change that at any point. So essentially what we're establishing now is a baseline with some tweaks as we go year to year. It's things that we add, things that we remove, things that we adjust based on where we need to go.
yep. And inevitably, if you go with any sort of evaluation tool that focuses on your goals and your constraints, when your goals and constraints and your progress measures change, that automatically changes the focus of the tool. So we now remove the old ones, put the new ones in, and we're off and running. Other thoughts?
I'm just doing a little bit of math here, and I don't know if what your thoughts are on this, just kind of putting weights to each of the indicators there and looking at the constraints first. Like if you gave every piece of the constraints, 1.1, 1.2, all the way down, that's, if we put 5 points a piece for the entire constraints piece, that would be 45%. Meaning the 45% of the evaluation would be based on constraints, meaning 55 would be based on the goals, meaning each goal would be worth about 13.75%. I don't know if those numbers sound fair or not, but or if that's the way you've seen things done in the past, but I'm just trying to figure out a way to put weights to each of the.
I see it done a lot of different ways. I see some that say, you know, meeting the goal is worth 5 points, and each of the progress measures are worth 2 points each. I see some that say, if you meet the goal, you get all the credit for that goal, because the point of the progress measures is to let us know we're on track.
Yeah.
But even if you miss the goal, if you get most of the progress measures, we'll still count it because you're moving on the right track. So I see some doing like an all or nothing. You get all the points or no points, but you don't have to get everything. And then I see them, sometimes they mix them up. They might say, we're going to do 60% on goals and 40% on the constraints. Or again, 60 and 20 and then 20 on something else that we've identified. The board is going to give our feedback individually about how we've interacted with you or whatnot. So I see lots of different options there. I think a wider question is I didn't expect us to come to a decision today. Okay. Ultimately, you all need to decide on a process in which you want to evaluate the superintendent, ideally to have it in place by the start of the next school year, so Superintendent Vasquez knows what they're trying to achieve going forward. I think you have a number of options. We could, you know, people can also reflect on this, think about it. We'll talk more about committees as we get to board operating procedures, but superintendent evaluation is a really meaningful board committee because it ultimately is the board doing board work. So you might choose to say, we're gonna have a committee of people that are going to get together and actually like hash out what this could look like and bring a recommendation back to the full board. Or the full board could think about it for a while and say, next workshop, we want to come back and talk about it some more. There's a lot of options here. This is just the start of that conversation. But I think your timeline, my coaching would be to finalize what your process will be going forward, at least by the start of the next school year. Any other thoughts, feedback, ideas, concerns?
Just a question for you, I'm sorry.
Let's go to Maribel and then
Thank you.
President.
Where administration's gonna have to create a baseline, so everything that has TBD on there, would you recommend that those have a smaller percentage this year because it's really building the system, or would they have a heavier percentage because it's actually building the system to evaluate? What are your thoughts, or what have you seen?
Yeah, so the way that, so essentially, because, and going back to the conversation in November and December, and Superintendent, correct me if this is off, because we're putting in place for the first time things like Amira and STEM scopes and actually doing the correlation, this is the first year where they're doing all of these. And then I think they actually specified for each of them, by May of 2026, by the end of this year, they'll have enough data from this year to be able to say, all right, we ended the year on STEM scopes in 8th grade at this level.
Okay,
If we're going to move to this, then we should achieve this by the end of 2027 and this by the end of 2028.
okay,
So it looks like what's going to happen regardless about those is the administration is going to bring back to the board and say, now that we have enough data, here's what our baselines were this year, and here's what we would expect to grow next year, the year after, which is why any system you would adopt would be for next year. You would basically plug those in based on that conversation, and then however you use it. Now, Superintendent Vasquez and his team know, hey, one of the things that we're focused on here is moving third grade students on Meet STAR, and then what we're paying attention to is STEM scopes at the younger grade levels. And so now you have the language to talk through the entire system about, are we on track, are we not on track, et cetera.
thank you for clarifying my thinking. So it's not about creating the system, it's just we're waiting on data so that we have our metrics there, and they already have the engine of how we're gonna evaluate and what systems you're gonna put in place to show that growth. Perfect,
Yeah, for the
thank you.
TBD ones, yes.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
And if we look at it, sorry, I think it was your turn. And if we're looking at aligning the evaluation timeline with the data timeline, we're either going to run long for an annual evaluation, or we're going to have to do a shorter, I don't want to call it temporary or interim, but it's almost going to be like a shorter
formative?
evaluation to meet that. Is there, from just, I mean, and it's probably up to us, but I mean, is there anything from a procedural perspective that would say, hey, don't do an 18-month evaluation, do a 6-month evaluation, and then get on to
Yeah.
this timeline, or like what's common practice there?
By law, you have to do it every year. I see, the most common way is usually boards will do the official annual evaluation in December or January. The reason being, you get all, like, yes, you get ideas about what your STAR data is in the summer, but it doesn't get finalized until September, October. That's when they release the taper report. So because most of your data is state data on some of this stuff, CCMR, et cetera, you would usually do your official evaluation for this school year, FY 25 to 26, probably in December of 26 or early 27. Usually what I see boards do is they'll have something like that, where that's when they do the official evaluation. If you do mostly quantitative things, whether it's survey or otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. You know, you get the data, you see what it is that we saw, superintendent, you achieved 3 out of the 4 goals and 2 out of the 3 constraints. Great, that's a communication point we can have for the community. The board still goes and decides if we need to do an extension or whatever else. But then I think it is great practice if this board does have a mid-year conversation. Usually at that time, you're having that in January, so we're giving you your data from last year, and we can give you any feedback or updates based on how we see this year going. The other nice thing is if you're aligning it to your priorities, you have a calendar, you're going to be looking at progress towards your priorities every single month. So in a lot of ways, your board meetings, when you monitor your priorities, you're going to be monitoring health plan sustainability twice a year and asking questions about that. So you'll know in June or July or whenever that comes up, whether or not we're on track for that one or not. So you basically are building in every single month formative evaluations where you're having conversations and he's being able to share with you, here's what we're doing on financial sustainability. Here's what we're doing on 8th grade algebra. Here's what we're doing on CCMR. And so those become, in an ideal world, they're telling you on progress. They shouldn't be a surprise at the end of the year when we get the data, because we've seen all year long if we've been on track or off track.
That's what we did in the past. with our former not Dr. Carmen, but Dr. Espinosa, we did a 6-month evaluation back in January. We did that for several years, so that way he knew where we were at. We knew where the district was at. He just talked to us about it. And then we did the final evaluation back in June or July. I think it was in, actually, it was in June, right? June. But we did a 6-month evaluation, and that kind of helped us.
And Mr. Guerra, it was valuable to have that kind of, I call it a formative.
Yeah, so he
to
had
where you could
information.
give feedback, and
Exactly.
then once the final, whatever questions we might have would have been clarified with the data, and then, okay.
Was that responsive to your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So, and actually, I'm glad that you went first, because just, this was my thought process, because I'm thinking, okay, so, I was trying to confirm, because I think we did the formal evaluation in November, the most recent one for Mr. Vasquez. And as Mr. Guerra said, typically the formative was in January, so that was the 6-month check-in. So if that is the way, and I think it worked good, and part of it was because we were aligning maybe the superintendent evaluation with, kind of restating on, with the summative being in July, right before the school year started. It's kind of restating or reviewing what progress was made last year, what's the plan for the coming year. It's, right before school starts, et cetera. So I think that cycle worked well. And if we move forward with the goal in mind that we're going to have a formal instrument or tool, that we can use for July, then we meet the timeline again of having the superintendent's eval within the year, within the 12-month period, because we would be doing it in July. And we actually would have, just any time before the end of November, because that's when we did it last. I'm thinking out loud. Did that make sense?
No, well, yes, I see what you're saying, but when we evaluated Mr. Vasquez, we did it as his interim work for November. When we did Espinosa's, we did his in January for the 6 months, and then we did his final evaluation in June, July. So we did Mr. Vasquez in November, we could do the final, obviously, in June, July, and then come January, we could do another 6 months. The board would agree with that.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, sir.
So so what it sounds like, there's a desire to have multiple, have a mid-year and an end-of-year whenever those
Correct.
months happen. Superintendent Vasquez, so we have things like, and I'm not an expert in this. I know on the academic side, like third grade reading, you'll be able to know preliminarily in June,
Yeah.
but it won't necessarily be finalized by July.
Usually you want to do it till September, though.
Exactly, yeah.
That way, because they'll get the final about August, and it gives you a
August.
little bit of time.
Okay.
So, and that's with all of the metrics that we have, so that would
That's
be the
correct.
only recommendation that I would give. I love the mid-year, January, because that way you're closing out that first semester by January, February.
Yeah.
You could give us a good analysis of where we are, but then give them enough time to get the actual data from TEA. And you get it June, July, but it's not finalized until usually
August.
September,
Yeah.
August.
Is there anything tying us to those months? What if we did March and September?
No, and I think that's what we're discussing. The only thing that's tying us is when we get the data, or when administration gets the data formally from, and that way it's
For the end of
not
the
an
year.
estimate,
Yeah.
it's an actual
Yeah.
that's coming from the state.
But what I hear you saying, Ryan, is also like not for the final, which would be based on the data, is the do we need to have then the formative in January? Could the formative be in somewhere else? Or
Yeah, that would be up to us.
Well, that makes sense. There's no reason to evaluate them in June. We don't get the results till August. We can go back and say, okay, where we're at.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you
Hold
can
on,
kind of have those progress updates. I mean, shoot, we could do it quarterly if we wanted to, right? We could do it every 3 months if that's what we wanted, but.
If you you have your calendar, you'll be looking at your priorities every single month and having an update on it. It's not explicitly the superintendent's evaluation, but it stands to reason if your priority is third grade reading and you look at third grade reading every other month, you're having a conversation about progress.
I was just trying to find the dates of, right, because the calendar year and the fiscal year and the school year and the data release, like none of those dates line up, right? And so like when's the sweet spot where you get most of that information so you're not carrying over from last year to this year and vice versa?
Maybe you could let us know, Mr. Vasquez,
yeah,
or
and-
your team.
And I think in terms of the goals, September would make sense. However, when I look at the constraints, for example, like the first rating, we don't usually get to like November, December.
Oh, okay.
So that we might want to or think about that.
And along the same line with timeline, although not specifically for this, I would like to figure out a way to make sure that our other evaluation timeline is nested. So we can either do them off cycles, we're focused on one, not the other, or we're doing both of them at the same time.
For our internal auditor.
Yes, right. And I know we can't talk a lot about that now because it's not on the agenda, but just making sure that we're taking into account that we have 2 evaluations to do. And what does that timeline look like? Are we doing 2 in January? Are we doing 1 in from a workload perspective, what does that look like for us?
Just in terms, again, of just looking at both the goals and the constraints, December would probably, we would have all the data we need in December to be able to for you all to be able to make an informed decision. So, I don't know if that helps or not.
So
like
we could do the
December-
final evaluation in January, and we could do kind of like a mid-year check in June or July.
Do you like the December or the January?
I'm
Just to
good.
talk about, it's because we're talking about the prior year, right?
Yeah, I'm good.
yeah, that's right.
I would be good either way because, might be a good way to wrap up like at least the calendar year, and because we will have we'll have all the data by then.
Just
If
think
we
of the
can mid-year.
back-to-back, because November, December, and then we're coming back February to already look at
Yeah,
the year that we're in.
Yeah,
That way it's
yeah.
not too much.
yeah. I would be good with either.
But that's a good point, because if we wait till December, we're talking about last year's scores.
We are.
And then if we're behind, we don't know what you're doing to fix it. So maybe we should do one after we get the scoring in June and July.
Yeah,
Wait,
by
and
then we
maybe-
will have put together.
And then we know where we're at.
And we know that first is
Yes,
one
because that is
thing
more important,
that,
the scores. The scores more important than the rating.
To summarize, just to make sure I'm following, now that you have priorities, let's assume that at least a portion of your evaluation will be focused on these priorities. Starting fresh for the beginning of a year, you will have each year, so after the beginning of the year assessment, this board is going to, as is on your calendar, you'll receive updates on how you're doing on goals 1 and 2. But then in September, you'll receive updates on how you're doing on goal 3, and then on goal 4. And then in the November, you'll receive an update about health plan sustainability. You'll receive updates on each of the goals during the year. Then you'd get finalized data from the previous year, and now you would fill in your official evaluation for last year. Maybe you could even say, if it's in December, okay, we're finalizing your data from last year. We accomplished 3 out of the 4 goals and all 3 constraints. You could finalize that. You can, at that same time, also have a look at the current year and say, all right, we're halfway through this year. Here's what we've been on track for. Here's what we're not on track for. What are you doing? Give us a little bit more upside. And then at the end of the year in July, you're like, okay, how do we think we finished? You basically will know in September or June and July probably where you'll land. Did we meet them or did we not? They're not finalized necessarily. You'll do that later on. But maybe you are setting it up as a way to, in the middle of the year, we talk about progress to date. And at the end of the year, we look at how we finished the end of the year up and what's starting the next year. But then in that December meeting, you're officially finalizing the evaluation from the final year. But it's not like it's a, so really what you're thinking about is like a
You did a
3 cycles. It's like a year and a half long. In the middle of the year you're being evaluated for, you have an update. You look at the progress to date. In the summer, you look at what we think the progress was, and then we finalize it in the next December. So it's kind of like a 3 cycle. Is that more or less what I'm hearing about having both the conversation about the current year as well as finalizing it when we have the actual data?
I think you summarized it very well.
Yeah.
The feedback that we gave you.
Yeah, and I think as long as that works, as long as it makes sense for Jim, the staff has enough time to do what they need to do to staff the numbers and the process.
Yeah.
Because what we don't want to do is get data and then have a 2-week quick turn to present us everything, and we don't want that.
Okay, so again, as though we're thinking about this process starting for next year, 26-27 school year, you'll have your goals, you'll have it all set up at the beginning of 2026, so summer 2026. Then in the winter, you will look at progress for the 2026-27 school year, what's happening, let's have a conversation about what's happening, what's changing, what are we adjusting. And oh, by the way, we'll also approve last year's evaluation that's now finalized. Then at the end of the year, all right, how do we think we finished for the year? Did we meet all of our things, et cetera? I know we still have to wait on data, yada, yada, yada. And then as we check in on the next year's stuff, we'll also finalize that year's data. So it's really that final evaluation is not a surprise because we've talked about it twice during the year, and now it's just the final numbers of it. I like that. That seems to make a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense.
I think that gives you enough feedback from all of us, and then we feel very comfortable when we're doing the final that truly we have all the information to make that quantitative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems
Yeah,
like
it
most
is.
of you've already had the conversation, so the official adoption is, we've already talked about it, so we know where we landed.
And I think that helps with what you were saying. How do we give that qualitative feedback? I think we're going to have those opportunities, and then at the end, it's just the final quantitative that,
Makes sense to me.
alrighty. Thank you, Ben.
Okay.
And I like this tool. Like, I don't necessarily know that I want to change it. I think we just need to figure out what our numbers look like from a grading perspective. One, because I don't know how long we can say this, so I'm going to use it, but you know, from a new board member perspective, and that's really the first time looking at this, it's really easy to understand, and it gives us a foundation and a baseline from which to depart later, instead of trying to figure it out on the fly.
Yeah, there's
Like,
no
we can
guesswork.
tweak this. So
Well, it's funny you say that. I was sitting down here and I'm thinking, I've been here already 14 years. We always evaluate at the end of the year. We won't get the results. So this other way, it makes sense because you know how the results are. You know what the goal is, and it's if they're attainable or not. We always did the superintendent evaluation at the end of the month, at the end of June. We didn't know the results till the following year, you know? This makes perfect sense.
Now you have me thinking, Paul, you could even say, given that we just talked about this 3-cycle thing where we look at the middle, we look at the end, and then we finalize. You don't even have to wait till the finalize. You can say, all right, these were the goals. At the middle, superintendent, please tell us which ones of these you think we're on track for, which ones we're not, and what we're doing. We'll have that conversation. At the end of the year, what do you think we accomplished? What do you think we not accomplished? And then the final data comes in, and now we're just approving what we have already known and talked about. So you can even adjust a format like this to get the information and tell that story.
yeah, I think it's a more elongated process than I would like, but I think it's efficient and there's no surprises.
Very transparent,
It's extremely.
especially for Mr. Vasquez.
Absolutely. Very
right.
straightforward.
Makes perfect sense.
So I took a lot of notes just to summarize here what I will do and what I think I heard on next steps, but y'all let me know otherwise. It sounds like we feel pretty good about this double formative and a final for the data. That would be formative in the middle, formative at the end, and then finalize once the finalized data is in, gets done. I heard that we generally feel good with something about this format. We need to decide on what the weights are. I heard to Trustee Woodcraft's point about, is there anything else that we need to make sure is here that is not captured by the numbers? That's a conversation to have. And then the question really is, I see 2 options for it. Either people can reflect on it individually, you can send me feedback specifically, and I can summarize it all at the next workshop or meeting, and you all can make a decision. Or if you wanted to do it as a group, so you can tell me about like your thoughts on preferences and weights and what you would recommend. Or you can allow Mr. Vasquez and his team to make a recommendation at the next board meeting or workshop, whatever. Or you could have a committee come together on some other way and decide on what you want to do. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to move forward. You want to all give me feedback? You want to turn it over to Mr. Vasquez to make some recommendations? Or do y'all want to continue to workshop it either as a whole group or
I kind of like the idea of getting feedback from cabinet.
Great.
And just, I mean, they're the experts, they're the ones that are,
Yeah, I almost would like to even run it by Kelly and her team. They're kind of the statisticians, maybe give us some feedback on what they think the weights should be. We could bring something back.
I personally would like to start with their, I guess, their recommendations. And then, I mean, if we want to tweak it, then we can, but I
Yeah.
think it's a good place to start.
The one thing that I would add is individually, if we could look at it, I know that when we developed it, are they all equal? For example, if we're looking at student outcome goal 1, the early literacy 3rd grade, is that equal importance, the literacy to the numeracy, which is on the, goal number 2? And if they're all equal, we could give that feedback to administration so that our experts can. And is it equal? I think, Ben, you mentioned that. In our minds, are the student outcome goals should have the equal weight to the constraints? Or should one be weighed? Because you even mentioned, what about 55 to 45? As a team, I think if we give Mr. Vasquez that feedback, then they could create whatever recommendation for us that would truly meet our needs. So I think those are the questions that I have for the team. Do you feel that the goals should have equal points? Are they as equal, are they equally as important as the constraints? Are any of those a little bit more important that they should pay a little bit more attention to than the others? And that way, our experts could then give us their
Yeah, and I
recommendation.
will, just to put this in practice, what you're essentially saying is, and my first recommendation would be, if you have thoughts to weigh in, you have 3 options on goals versus constraints. Either they weight it equally, goals a little bit more, constraints a little bit more. In reality, what happens is, there will be decisions that get made that, okay, there's this new strategy that I feel really strongly about and my team feels strongly about. If we do it, we feel like we can move our literacy goal, but it will cost us on our financial constraint. This is gonna give them the decision-making matrix on which way the board would like them to do. If you keep them weighted equally, then it's like, okay, you know what? Win one, we lose one, but we'll just make the decision on our own about which one we wanna prioritize, the reading or the financials. That you're basically saying to the superintendent, we don't have a preference, you and your team make the decision that you think is best, equally weighted. If the board says that goals, the reading is worth more, financials are important, but when you have to make a decision that is gonna go one way on the goals and the other way on the constraints, make the decision to the goals. The superintendent's gonna say, they have prioritized our reading more, so even though it'll cost us a little bit on the financial side, I'm willing to do that because we need to move the reading faster. And then vice versa, is if you have the constraints weighted more. The superintendent says, well, they worry about the financials more than the reading, so I'm gonna tilt that way and not make the decision to do that. Essentially, by picking which one you want to weight more, in the situations where the superintendent is having to choose a decision that's going to improve one but hurt the other one, which way are they gonna go? You're either telling them, doesn't make a difference, choose the goal, or choose the constraint. So I will, with that framing, I wonder if people do have thoughts on,
Does the weighting change based on the year? Does it change ever? And my thinking is, for example, academically, we're solid. I mean, we've been great. Our goals we set the goals because they matter.
yep,
But our healthcare and our constraints right now are not they're not in a good place. They have a lot of growing to do. So in my mind, because that's where we're hurting, I almost feel like, does that weigh more now than it would next year? I'm not sure that I'm,
the answer to your question about do the weightings change? The answer is the weightings change as the board decides they change. The board picks what those weights are. My recommendation is you shouldn't try to change them every year because it's changing the superintendent's calculus every year. And I wouldn't think about it necessarily in a crisis. You have set these goals and constraints explicitly with the expectation that the superintendent do all of them.
Right.
So like you're gonna try to get growth on all of them. And then my personal coaching is, I would hesitate to say you should ever weight your constraints more than your goals, because the constraints are important, but that's not the reason schools exist. The reason schools exist is to make sure tomorrow's leaders are learning today. So I could see a good argument for leaving them even, if you feel that way, or weighting the goals more. I would hesitate before setting the constraints higher. But that's just what I would think through about it. But
Okay.
ultimately, you all control the weights just like you control the goals and the constraints.
Ben, I have a question. And I was talking to Mr. Nakana. explain to me, I get the weight, I understand that, but when we evaluate the superintendent, we never got a score sheet. We just always do exceeds, meets, or doesn't meet expectation. That's what we've done in the past.
Yep.
So now when we weight him, and he gets 80 points out of 100, how are we going to base that to exceeds, meets, or I guess it's totally different now.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to give it I mean, we all go to 100 points because that's generally what we're used to in schools. There's nothing that says you have to do that. You could also just say, we have 7 points. You get 1 point for each goal and 1 point for each constraint. How many out of the 7 priorities did you achieve? Did you achieve 5 out of 7, 4 out of 7? That's equal weighting. You're weighting them the same. But, you know, or you can, I've seen also boards do it out of 100 is the most common. And then they might decide on and say, anything above 70, you're meeting our expectations. They just picked it out of nowhere, but, you know, most boards set goals, set rigorous goals. So you don't expect your superintendent to every single year get every single one because then you've made the goals too easy. So usually boards will just decide or just say like, you know, we got 70 out of 100. What does that mean? What you do with that? That's your conversation to have, not mine. But it just kind of gives a baseline of what happens year after year as opposed to just, we feel like you're exceeds this year or we feel like you're at meets this year.
And I think that so what, Ben, is what matters when it comes to the weights and the points. Because that was the thought going through my head is you ladies were talking, is like, what's the so what? Mm-hmm. What if we give everything 1 point? Like, so what? Like, who cares? Like, it's magic, right? So, like, what's the enforcement or the authority behind it? And I think that might be another separate conversation that we need to, and maybe tonight's the night, I don't know, but.
I think once we get the points put in here, then you're exactly right, Paul. We have to identify, you know, what does 7 points mean to us collectively? And that way, transparently to Mr. Vasquez, he'll know if I get 7 points, that means this is where I'm gonna land. If I get 9 points, and I'm just making up now, if I get 10 points.
If that's tied to whatever at the end, if it's
Yeah.
pay raise, if it's vacation days, like, I don't know.
It's just-
like, what's the gate that unlocks at the next goal marker?
So that would mean that we're moving away from what we've typically done and what we did this last time, which was does not meet, meets, and exceeds.
What I
And
would
it-
say is you don't necessarily have to do that. What you would be saying here is you just be correlating these. You'd say 70 points and above is exceeds.
Right, and so that's not what I'm saying. I'm reminding everybody what we did last time, and you know, if we're going to go to this 100-point scale or whatever, but I think we need to give Mr. Vasquez some indication of the direction we would like to move, because then that, I mean, if he's going to go to the staff and say, all right, well, these are the goals, and this is, you know, this is the scoring system that they would like to use. Is it just going to, you know, and
Maybe as a hybrid, we don't give it numbers. Right? As a hybrid, we give them block checks. So goal number 1, and then we have 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3. So maybe he gets a check in 2 and an X in 1. And if you get 2 of the 3, that's meets. If you get 3, that succeeds. If you get 1 of the 3, that's did not meet. And then we tie the ramifications to each of those 3. So maybe it's not a point system per se, but for goal number 1, if you got 0 or 1 of 3, you failed. If you got 2 of 3, you meet. If you got 3, you exceed. What does that mean? Next block. And then we're not tied to points and evenly and more heavily weighted or not heavily weighted, but I think then the onus is on us to determine what that means. So if he, you know, meets 2, exceeds 1, fails 1, what does that mean? Because if what I've learned over the past, it's almost been a year, hasn't it? Goodness gracious. The evaluations don't really go anywhere. It's not like they're part of his resume if he ever applied for another superintendent position. It's not like he's ever going to get promoted here again, right? And so it's really like
superintendent.
right? So what's the so what, right? Like what's the reason why he wants to get exceeds versus meets? Because if there's no, I'll use the Lane Kiffin approach, right? Like Lane Kiffin's getting paid by Ole Miss while he's at LSU because Ole Miss is still playing ball. Right? Like, hey, you hit these gates, you're going to get a bonus, you're going to get a pay raise, you're going to get something. Right? Like, what's that driving factor?
And
Well,
the way that
typically-
I see it is, I'm sorry, it's Mr. Vasquez's report card, kind of, for his self-growth. So truly what you had mentioned, Alice, is, you know, for him to give us, you know, the recommendation, either points or, and I guess we're giving you that feedback. It could either be points or it could be just, you know, you met this criteria, and out of those criteria, 2 out of 3 means exceeds, you know, meets, or however you want to do it. Or just unsatisfactory, satisfactory, and exemplary. I'm sorry.
And typically in the past, the way we did it, well, majority of the time was when he exceeded or meet the expectation. The reason why the goal was superintendent would get a pay raise or we would extend his contract to 3 years. When they're not that good, we'd just get a 1-year contract. Most superintendents would like a 3-year contract. If it's a 1 year, that means that, okay, there's some issues. And that's the reason why it goes.
If I may, there's, I think, a couple points I'd like to make. Number one is, while this is the superintendent's evaluation, I would push to consider it not as the superintendent's report card, but actually the district's report card. Because in an ideal world, the superintendent's job is to do what? It's achieve the system priorities that we, Socorro ISD board, have said is the most important. So it's kind of one and the same, is that, you know, what we see oftentimes, and what I see oftentimes in districts that struggle, is their superintendent is either rated great or rated poorly, and that has no correlation to whether the district is doing well or not. I see a lot of times when districts are struggling mightily, kids are struggling, and their superintendents are exceeds expectations every single year. Something's not matching there. I also see the opposite. I see districts knocking it out of the park, making some big strides, but because they made some difficult decisions to do that, now board members are against the superintendent. I see them get rid of superintendents or rate them low, below expectations, even though the system is making leaps and bounds. And I think as a board, your responsibility is to, if we have said these are the priorities, how do we make sure we're working in the same vein? So that is number one. To the second point is, to the so what it is. Right, on a personal level, Superintendent Vasquez, you're not going to get a promotion here. You got it pretty much where you're at. At the same as Lane Kiffin's not going to get a promotion from head coach in the head coaching world unless he goes to a different league or something like that. But at the end of the day, the evaluation is not about the promotion. An evaluation should be about focus and what you want them to focus on for the benefit of your entire system. So whatever you all set, point blank period, whatever you set or don't set as the evaluation becomes the focus. And the most common way that I see this is where you don't have this, where you show up once a year and we've gotten a rubric of things to fill out and I rate you exceeds or not exceeds, et cetera, and we talk about it. The focus is not on any of the outcome goals or even the state ratings, anything like that. The focus is about how I feel about you, superintendent, in that moment. And so what you're really trying to do here, in whatever system you create, what you put on the superintendent's evaluation becomes the focus of the superintendent, inevitably, because superintendents, I don't think you're any different, Superintendent Vasquez, is you want to do good. You want to achieve what you get set out to do. And so I think that's really the heart of the so what is you're making it clear to the superintendent, but also I would say to your community. The clearer you can make this, and you can go back out to your community and say, we had 7 priorities. Superintendent met 5 of them this year. We feel that's really strong because we set some aggressive priorities. We look forward to next year. It changes the conversation rather than, we had a conversation and decided that they meet expectations. We'll meet expectations on it. So I think there's some to think about here as a multiple, less so about like the superintendent themselves. You're giving the superintendent feedback through all your formative evaluations. This is really about a system-focused tool and a community communication tool about what's important and how we're aligning our systems.
Yeah, I think the parallel that I keep making with like the football coach thing, you're almost like Dan Campbell from the Detroit Lions now, right? Not that SISD was 0-16 at one point, but right, like you bring a new culture, you bring, the players in that fit, the culture that you want. You have the drive, the grit. You make it 15-2, you go to the NFC Championship, right? And like there's potential, there's growth. That's good. Everybody's excited about that. The flip side is sometimes they get stagnant, and you have a Hall of Fame coach like John Harbaugh that just got let go because he's annually a conference champion. they're a division champion, annually in the playoffs, but never quite there. And so what I don't want to do is let emotion take over, you know. And if we use a tool that's consistently it meets expectations, I'm like, well, Jimmy done good.
Yeah.
We ain't great, but
Yeah.
Jimmy done good, right? And like, at what point, you know, do we as a board take that to the next level of John Harbaugh? Hey, it's done pretty good, but we're not where we want to be, and we need to make a change, right? And making sure that that's clear and open and transparent, not a surprise, because it's been meet expectations for 7 years, and you're like, yeah, but I'm meeting what you told me to do, and so I think that's the part that I'm struggling with is like the so what, what's the incentive behind it, what's the drive behind it, you know, kind of what's that other than, hey, I want to do good, I want to meet board expectations and have students succeed and teachers be happy, like what's that driving focus? And I think that's, for me, that's where that disconnect is on what's the Super Bowl and how often should we win it? Like, what is that in this setting?
Is that a rhetorical question? Or are you looking for a response?
It's rhetorical because I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what, and maybe it doesn't exist, and I'm just struggling to make that parallel.
And I would say I actually think you have to answer. You are the owners of this football team. It's your job as a board to determine what winning the Super Bowl is for Socorro ISD. My recommendation is you look at the next 5 years and what does winning the Super Bowl look like in the next 5 years? Specify it in your goals and your constraints or however you decide to do it. And that should be what winning the Super Bowl is. In my opinion, and that's what my coaching would be, is that you all should get together, and I think you did this, and said, what are the most important things? What does success look like? It looks like early literacy, early math, 8th grade algebra, college and career readiness going up by the amounts we identified, while we are proving that we can be financially responsible, put a healthcare sustainable plan in place, and make sure our student, family, and staff engagement go higher. That's what you basically said. Mm-hmm. If that's what winning the Super Bowl looks like in this room, then that's what I think it is for the next 5 years, and that's how you've decided to measure it. And if that changes, you know, then that's your prerogative to change it and say, okay, we're good on the healthcare plan sustainability. We have a new focus now. It's about retention of our effective staff, or it's about attendance and truancy, or it's about whatever. You can decide those things. But I think that's really your question to answer is what is winning the Super Bowl? 7 of y'all knowing that you are voted to be here to be voices for the community to determine what winning the Super Bowl is so he can get clear direction on it. But that's just one guy. All right, I'll summarize what I've heard so far and the next steps. So here's what I heard. I had a lot of awesome conversation. Thank you all for that. Number one is a reflection around, are these everything that we want, or do we lose something in just having them numeric? Is there other things that are missing that we would want to think about adding? It's an open question. Number two, there's value on being specific, so we're all on the same page. So we like the specificity of these things. Number three, we want to make sure that there is formative evaluations in the process, so it's not a surprise at the end. And we talked about the format of potentially doing a middle of the year and end of the year, and then a finalized version of this that kind of go through this process. Heard about how do we think about this evaluation process in alignment with the auditor evaluation process, because they are kind of the two evaluations that the board does. And then giving all of that kind of with that discussion, seems like we have a decent starting point. We got to think about the weights. I didn't hear anyone weigh in on what they thought about the weights should be, so feel free to. But I think what I heard the next step recommendation being is, you've heard the conversation, superintendent and your team, to think about timeline, weights, et cetera, and bring back a recommendation to the board based on what you see for the board then to determine if they want to make any further adjustments, change, et cetera. Did I summarize that correctly for next steps and anything here? Here nods. All right. Any other questions, next steps, last thoughts here? Paul looks like he's about to say something.
I don't think, I'm not disagreeing with the points, but I don't want to say, Mr. Vasquez gets, out of 100, he got 70 points, so he got a C. I'm just saying, the public's going to see a C. Oh, he's not doing good. You got a B. He's not doing good. So I don't want to base it that way. You know, I was just thinking how we evaluate teachers, and but I like the point scale so we know where we stand, but not as a numerical grade.
Got it.
Because it'll be impossible to get 100 every single time.
Yeah, I'd be worried about you if you got 100 every single time, unless you were knocking to the park for 100% of kids every single time. So, and I don't know a district in America that's there. So, what I hear though in this, and tell me if I heard this correctly, is as you think about what the system should be, if we use numbers and you recommend numbers, cool. But then how are we communicating this more broadly where it's not just the number, it's about what the number means. So if there's a range of, here's the numbers, we got this many goals and constraints, we achieve them, how are we communicating that? That's exceeding expectations based on what we went, or whatnot. Is that more or less accurate? Like how do we take the numbers and make them more meaningful than just what people might perceive being a C or a D? Because you might set really rigorous goals that if you achieve half of them and you make growth on the other ones, but you didn't achieve them, that's still probably pretty good.
A thought, because I think this is kind of up to your point. So if we do a hybrid of pass fail, check mark X, and then you assign a point value by goal and constraint based on checks and X's. For example, let's say that exceed standards is 5 points, meet standards is 3 points, and fail to achieve is 1 point. If you get no checks or 1 check, you get a 1 point. If you get 2 checks, you get 3. If you get all 3 checks, you get 5 points. And if I'm doing math in public,
Dangerous proposition.
right? 4 goals, 3 constraints, that's 35 points. If we wanted to make it nice and round and call it 50, right? If you get 5 points in all 4 goals, you get another 5 points, right? Same thing for constraints, that puts you at 45. And then maybe there's a 5-point block for intangibles, right? Where it's feelings and butterflies and climate of the day and sunshine and rain and like whatever for 50 points. But it's kind of a hybrid between, hey, you didn't get a C, right? But sometimes a 3 is okay because you couldn't get all 3 done, right? Like 3 is okay.
I would be hesitant to put a letter grade to this, though.
Yeah.
That's going to be the headline,
Yeah.
Yeah.
The public will
Yeah.
understand that.
Yeah.
They see, oh, he got a B, or B minus, or a C.
No,
Right,
I
but what,
think- Sorry, I think the range of points has to equal to unsatisfactory, satisfactory, and exceeds. We'll stay away from the A, B, C. It's just, that's too much, there's too much meaning behind that because we've all been in education for so long.
yeah.
So if whatever you create, whatever those guidelines or parameters, it's equal to unsatisfactory, satisfactory, and it exceeds,
Yeah.
or exemplary, however you want to do it. And I think that helps us with our talking points. You know what? He's a solid satisfactory, however, like you said, next year as he's, however, it's improving, and this is why, and we go right back to the data.
Yeah, and whether it meets expectation or satisfactory
Yeah,
or
whatever
whatever
you
that,
wanna-
that verbiage is.
Yeah,
And
and stay away from A through F.
Yeah.
what I'm hearing in this conversation is something like undergirding the numbers. You might use numbers to calculate where it fits, but then there's basically, you could even have a sentence that is like a headline sentence put together that basically every year says the superintendent and his team achieved blank out of our 7 priorities, and even on the blank that he didn't fully achieve, he made growth on 3 of those or whatnot. Therefore, we've rated him satisfactory or exceeds expectations. Like, you could have something like that gets filled in every year that becomes just a headline that you could share, and this is here's how many you achieved,
Yeah.
here's what it is. There's some math behind it around the intangibles and butterflies or whatnot, and then we ended up with this, and this is why he's exceeds or achieves or et cetera.
And then we could highlight the things that were, that you did exceed as far as the data for the students.
Yeah, and I
Or
think
the
being able to
financials or-
quantify how many of these goals and constraints did he exceed expectations, how many did he meet, and then how much are we struggling on?
Yep.
Versus 70 out of 100 or
Yep.
right, whatever.
It's the messaging.
Yeah.
Superintendent, any thoughts, questions before you and your team go back and take this back and come up with some ideas?
No, it's great feedback, and it'll give us something to chew on over the next couple of days.
All right. Thank you for engaging. Good conversation, y'all. All right. With that, we'll move on to the meat of this, which is board operating procedures. You have a folder with a number of different things in it. You have your board operating procedures as they currently are, as well as 3 policies that get referred to a lot in board operating procedures. I am not going to go through every single comment that I made. There's a few big areas that I'm going to draw your attention to. and that we'll have a conversation around, and I'll walk you through where we're at each time. Based on this, again, there's no adjustments to your board operating procedures. These are your board operating procedures, et cetera. I will walk you through some of the big areas that I think be most helpful for you to have a conversation around. I am just gonna take a whole bunch of notes about what you all say, what you want, what you don't wanna change, et cetera. Ask a bunch of questions. Based on what you tell me tonight, my recommendation, and you can always change this, would be then I take all of that into account, and then I actually take your board operating procedures and make the adjustments that you told me about tonight. And then I will share that back with you fully redlined about here's what, based on what you said, what you should change, what you shouldn't, et cetera. At that point, it will become your document, and we will look through the actual red lines so you can see the language. And then you can decide which of those you like, you don't like, you change them as you see fit. You then eventually go through your regular policy adoption process throughout this spring to adopt whatever your new board operating procedures will be. So essentially, tonight is just a conversation high level about some of the most important elements that you probably need to talk through and work through. And then after that point, I take a stab at putting it into writing for you, and then you can actually look at it like a policy that you would consider adoption, kind of like a TASB update, and you all take it through and decide what you want to change, what you want to keep, what you want to adjust, et cetera. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? All right. So then we will move forward. Your board operating procedures, I'm going to turn to the first area. I didn't make any notes on number 1 or number 2, which kind of is just the high-level introduction. You talk about the duties of the Board of Trustees. These are just the laws about what trustees do, et cetera. What are the statutory duties? I would like to start on page 3. You have a large segment here called Duties of the Superintendent as Specified in Board Policy, BJA Local. I also have BJA Local printed out for you with comments on it. At the highest level, you have a whole lot of things on this bullet point list in your board operating procedures. The 2 big findings I would have is, number 1, a lot of the bullet points you have in here are actually not in your policy. And you have bullet points in your policy that aren't in your board operating procedures, so they don't match. You should first of all design what it needs to be and make sure they both match. Then number 2, there's a number of bullet points that you have that really blur the line from my perspective in terms of governance versus management. I'll give you one example here. So you have one bullet point that says the superintendent will work with the staff and the board and the community in curriculum planning. And overall, that's a big question about, because the way I read that is you expect the superintendent to go and have community meetings to help them design on what teachers should teach and how teachers should teach it. I don't know if that was the intent of this, but that seems to be one that is kind of blurring the lines between what you've expected the superintendent to do and what the superintendent's job is versus what the board's job is. So my overall feedback here that is an open conversation. There's a lot of things that a superintendent is legally required to do. And then there are a lot of things that you would expect a superintendent to do, that if a superintendent isn't leading with integrity or communicating effectively, et cetera, you might have other concerns about the superintendent. I would think about this not to list off everything you could possibly want for a superintendent, but to think about, are there any of these particular things that are above and beyond that we expect in Socorro ISD because Socorro ISD is unique? And then think about what those elements would be rather than just listing off a lot of different elements. So my question for you, I'll just read some of the notes that I made here, and then I just want your feedback on these. Does it make sense? Would you like to keep them? It's all your policy. You have a lot of things in here that are listed in qualifications that feel like they should already be known. So first of all, a master's degree that the superintendent should have, or that the superintendent should be certified, or that the superintendent should have public school experience. You note some of these things that are actually there in law already. Like superintendent has to have a certification. They can do a probationary for a little bit, but they can't just be fully uncertified forever. But are there anything in here that you feel like is above and beyond that, yes, we need that in any superintendent we have, or you'd be okay with removing some of these things from policy and just being specific about what a superintendent should do in Socorro ISD. One thing that I see very much missing is you have priorities now. You don't have any language around the superintendent should focus on achieving the priorities of the school system. It's more about the how we do that, as opposed to the what you want them to accomplish. So there's a lot of bullet points here. There's kind of a lot of oversee. It seems like you have a lot of additional stuff in here. Just want to open it up to see your reaction to my comments there, what you like, what you don't like, what you want to keep, what you don't want to keep, and see if anyone had any strong thoughts on those.
Mr. Mackey, one thing that you said is that many of the things that we have here are already, let's say, part of TEA guidelines. So I guess my recommendation would be that we would just put that on there, because oftentimes individuals locally, they know how to go to the policies, and this is kind of like a guideline for them to look of, or, yeah, where else they could look to get X, Y, and Z information. So if we feel that we don't need it in here, just where it goes, where they can go to get
Yeah.
that information.
Yep.
And I think that would help us consolidate or make our policy.
So maybe a language around like, in addition to all items required in BJA legal
There
and
you go.
on the TEA website here,
Yes.
here are the additional elements that Socorro ISD expects of its superintendent. And then just, I like that. That makes a lot of sense.
Mr. Nahra, for you, when we posted the job opening for the superintendent position, did we just post this? Because that's what it looks like. Like, this would be on LinkedIn. Like, oh, here's what we expect of our next superintendent. Apply if you want to. But that's just,
Yeah.
because if it's not intended to be a job posting, then I don't know why we have it at all. Like,
Well,
at
and-
all.
I read your first comment.
Yeah.
Consider doing away with this policy completely. And as I go through this policy, I think, well, okay, I really do think it's redundant because we have a superintendent job description. And like any posting, if we open a position, there's an associated job description that goes with it. And what happens if the job description conflicts with this?
Yep.
Or the other way around? And we've also adopted the goals and constraints, and we're about to create or continue the process of the evaluation instrument, so I don't know why we need this.
And I will tell you why, and I can't speak specifically to Socorro ISD, but I can speak pretty specifically to every school district. Policies usually they're oftentimes operate as a coral reef. At some point, someone had a need to put something new in policy, and we add the thing in policy. And then it continues, we forget about that need, and then we add something new because there's a new need. And so they kind of grow over time. And what we'll talk about as later on into this year and into the start of next year is like actually going through all of your policies. It's a good thing to determine, do we still need this policy? Because otherwise what you end up with is a bunch of conflicting ones. There's an option to do something here. Again, I agree. I don't know why you necessarily need everything you have listed here in BJA local. You could also have this as say, here is our BJA legal requirements of a superintendent and what's outlined in TEA, and see the exhibit policy for our superintendent job description, which we update each time we post it for a superintendency or something like that. And then you can just have your job description be this policy.
So this was issued in January of 19. So what was going on in January of 19 that we needed to issue this policy? And then I think, and that's rhetorical. I don't really need an answer on that. But the one that I would like an answer to, for those that have been around the block for a while, is what's the ramifications if we do away? What are the unintended consequences if we do away with the policy? Is there something that we're now in conflict with?
I think as long as we have the legal policy, then we're okay.
And
Yeah.
just like I mentioned, it's a roadmap to anybody looking for information, where else do I get information?
Yeah.
So it's just more of a transparency piece in my eyes. And again, we could adjust it to where it just has one or two bullet points, but it's really, I liked your idea of the exhibit.
Yeah.
And that way, it's easy to find for whomever, the transparency piece.
Yeah, it's-
Unintended consequence would be then, our community would say, okay, they don't have a local, it would just be legal, and the legal is a little bit more difficult to read than local policy, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, I look at that website once a month, and you click between the tabs to figure out which one says which and how they nest. But I'm a policy nerd, so I enjoy that. But what I don't want to do is, if we remove this, then what else was already tied or tethered to it? Like, what's further down the tree that if we remove this, now these links are broken, right? And that's what I don't know is, what are the unintended consequences that we want to prevent if we delete the entire thing? And if the answer is nothing, great, but
The answer is generally nothing for local policies. There are some instances, and so just for everyone's case, I think most of y'all know this, but legal is what the state says. Then you as a board have the option to be more specific than what the state says. You can never contradict the state, but you can then add some additional. So the superintendent requires these things of the superintendent. We're also going to require the superintendent has been a school principal or whatever. You can make those determinations in your local policy. But the local policy should be those things that are additive on top of the legal policy, or maybe summarizing it or pointing in that direction. Then everything that you don't put there, then you delegate to the superintendent in regulation policy. So now these are the superintendent says, okay, oftentimes this might be like grading. We want to have this type of grading scale, but we delegate to the superintendent to be specific about the grading scale. And now the superintendent and his team do a whole bunch of research and then put a grading scale in regulation. And then if there's any additional documents, that becomes your exhibits of the policy. So you don't necessarily have to have a local for all this. In some instances, the state says in the legal policy, the board must adopt a policy around grading scale. Then that kind of says you have to have a local policy, and you can decide to either adopt it yourself or delegate it to the superintendent or so on. Oftentimes, in the vast majority of cases, eliminating local policy doesn't break anything, except if people are going to it for reference. I would also note that you can look at the traffic on your TASB site to see your policy. Most times it's not getting pulled a ton. I would actually say, and again, not a lawyer, but I would say what I've heard the most from lawyers is where you have contradictions, where you have a job description that contradicts your local policy, that contradicts the legal policy, then you open yourself up for issues because you've got, someone could point at the local policy and say, well, you adopted that, and that's what I did or I didn't do. So sometimes it's better to not say things rather than contradict yourself if you're not consistently looking at it and making sure it all aligns. Okay, any other thoughts here? So far I've heard, can we make it specific about where to find the requirements that exist rather than restate all the requirements? Maybe potentially removing this entirely as long as we have that in an exhibit that is our job description that we review and update and have the one that is essentially the case. Any other thoughts around any of the specifics or just generally how to organize it? That's been super helpful so far.
I've been looked at it word for word, but it kind of just looks like a restatement of the legal policy.
The other note generally I would say in your board operating procedures is economy of language matters. The more words you have in your board operating procedures, the less anyone will read any of the words. And so you want your board operating procedure, separate from your policy, to be a highlight of the most important things that board members and superintendents should be paying attention to. So the more you can center on the things that actually change our practice as opposed to we're saying it because we feel like we should say it, it makes it a more useful document to the new board members coming on. Instead of giving them 400 pages of all your policies to read, you've now distilled it down into here are the 7 most important pages we want you to read because it changes how you operate as a board member. So where you can cut from your board operating procedures, I think it makes the most sense to cut the most out of your board operating procedures. Then if you still want stuff in local policy, keep it in local policy. But if it's not even needed there, then leave it in legal or the exhibits or whatnot.
I think the board operating procedures was a mechanism to throw the book at someone, like you're being disruptive, you're, whatever. And, okay, here's how we try and set some guardrails. There's a whole bunch of, because even I think when you go in here and look at it, I mean, a lot of the things that are in here is be respectful. Remember the impact that you make when you're presenting at a campus or, and then even how the board interacts with each other, and that's what I it's setting up guardrails. It's saying, okay, this is acceptable, you know, and if you're doing something out of line here, but you don't need it printed to know that we don't stand here, point fingers, and yell at each other, you know? That's unacceptable behavior almost anywhere. So, except at a football game, since we were talking about football. Just kidding. You know, so, yeah, that was just a comment.
Well, I have a lot of personal feelings about the SOP, but I want to get through the business part of it first before I do that. But, I mean, even when we brought it up a few months ago, like, I don't know why we're voting on this in any capacity. Right? And there's reasons behind that. But if it's something that we must adopt, because if for nothing else, we're under conservatorship and TASB says we have to, or TA says we have to have that, then so be it. But I would like to get through the business side of it and Ben's comments, and then I'd really like to talk about the actual practicality of why it even exists. But it kind of goes back to your point.
Great. All right, any other questions on the specificity of the duties of the superintendent that we have talked about otherwise? We'll get to some of the higher level
Yeah,
questions.
I don't see anything on the agenda that says we're voting or taking action, but I'm completely okay if this whole thing goes away.
Yep, yeah, that's exactly the information we're looking for here.
Yeah.
There's no action happening here, but that would just come through your regular policy process, and you can, that's generally, if a policy is not giving new information to the superintendent or community that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, it is my recommendation that it generally doesn't fit. It's just more things, it's more red tape that your superintendent team have to look at before they make any decisions, so. All right, thank you for that. We will move to the next item. There's some other comments around here about like smaller things around, like, you know, the school board member's creed, and, you know, couldn't this be contained under the same section as all the other ability of that? The next page I want to turn your attention to is 6. So I have a lot of comments here, and I'll just, for some specifics, I'll just kind of let you know is, you know, your bullet point number 7 talks about handling complaints, basically. Bullet point number 8 talks about communication with board members and staff. Bullet point number 9 talks about things happening during board member meetings. Like, they're all kind of, each bullet point is a different topic. Not to say anything about the content of these, but from a usefulness perspective, the point of a standard operating procedure in a business sense or a board operating procedure is for any board member to say, is this inbounds or out of bounds? Where's the quickest place I can go look for it? Without a board operating procedure, they've got to then sort through all of the local and legal policies to figure out where it is. The purpose of a board operating procedure is, I'm a new trustee, I can just look it up and say, all right, how can I meet with trustees? Let me go there. Or how do board meetings work? I can go there and I can see all of those things. My recommendation on this page is not so much any of the particular bullet points. It is a recommendation about how you structure this. This is all under one segment called board member rules. It's basically rules of conduct for everything. And I would recommend to the board, and you all can decide what you want to do, is instead of just having a general heading about board member conduct and having a lot of number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where I have to read everything to find out what I want, I would recommend you actually instead order this by topic. So how to handle complaints, how to communicate with one another, how to communicate with the superintendent, how to communicate with staff. So I can go into it and find it much more quickly than trying to read all of the bullet points and decide which bullet point is applicable to the question at hand. So that would be my one big recommendation here. I'm curious of people's thoughts about that. It would be a kind of reorganization from how you currently have your board operating procedures.
I like that recommendation. When I became a new board member, again, administration now going to the board, this did help me as far as even, you know, if there's a complaint that is brought my way, I was used to just taking care of it, investigating, because I was on the administration side. So this truly helped me to say, okay, I need to get the information, how I do that. So this did help me, and the way that your by topic would have been much more helpful, because then I had to read the whole, and then I'm like, oh, okay, this is what it is. So I do see that that would be more effective for a new board member to be able to go through it. It would be more helpful.
Thank you. And just to summarize for anyone paying attention online or whatnot, the sections that I saw embedded here that I would recommend is handling complaints, communication with staff, board member meetings, conflicts of interest, violations of board operating procedures, and new board member onboarding as being different sections, and kind of taking as a starting point your language as it currently exists. And then when we look at that, you can decide if you want to change any of that language about those. All right. Any other thoughts here?
So I like the reorganization, but I would almost do it broader. If we go back to the very first pages, it's already broken down between duties of the board, statutory duties of the superintendent, duties of the superintendent as specified in board policy, and it feels like it bounces around. So if there is a board chapter, and then you have duties, scopes, responsibilities, do's and don'ts, whatever, superintendent all the way through, instead of back, forth, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth.
That makes sense. So under the larger things, so like board and superintendent relationship. And so it talks about communication, this, that. Superintendent duties, board duties, handling whatever they happen to be. So having the broad ones with subcategories.
Yeah, it's, when I first read and this was before I started campaigning, when I read this and I looked at it, this is a good quick reference guide for legalistic and local things. But there's a whole bunch of superfluous stuff in here that I really don't think applies. And it's so if it's a quick reference guide for legal and local, then let's make it that. And so we don't have to bounce back and forth between sections and websites. Let's make it a quick reference guide. And I think an easy way to do that is to help consolidate. Hey, if it's board related, here it is, all the way down the line. If it's superintendent related, here it is. Right? And then you can have those onesies and twosies, like, hey, here's some ways that weren't defined previously, but the superintendent and board do these things together. And I think that's just, if I'm looking for just superintendent stuff, I don't want to look through 7 pages. If I can find it on 2 and I just put it all together.
That makes sense. Any other thoughts here?
Hearing we hand Ryan a red pen there.
If you give me purview over this whole document goes away. I'm letting you know.
Did you say it goes away? Is that-
Goes away. Yeah. I'll put it in the other filing cabinet. Yeah.
And for me, it was helpful. As a new superintendent, sorry.
What?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a new board member, it was helpful to identify what my role was and how to work with a superintendent.
Yeah. I think it does contain some helpful information, but I do believe it is very, it's lengthy, and a lot of the information is redundant. Like, there's no purpose to it. It's
So I think as we look at editing this or changing it or adopting it or however, it's what's the intent? From a military perspective, a standard operating procedure means something. That's not what this is. This is a quick reference guide and a list of rules. That's not an SOP. And so what's really the intent behind this document? What are we using it for? What are we not using it for? Is it a hammer if we have a disruptive member on the board and that's all we're using it for? Is it like, what is it? Some of the other questions, and again, these are rhetorical because I think I already know the answer. Who's the authoritative figure in charge of this? Like, who's the enforcer? And has it really ever been used before? Has this document been used with the previous board?
I will say, and kind of to Maribel's point, it helped me when I was starting because I didn't know how to do anything. And so it kind of helped me understand what is my role, what's the board's role, how do we communicate? So in that sense, it was helpful as well. But to your point, I think there's a need. I just don't know exactly what.
And I think when we find what that is, this will be so much better.
Yeah. Yep.
But like as constructed, if you gave this to me now, quick reference guide, legal, local responsibilities, duties, great. Let's set it up that way. But like, what is the need for this, and is it helpful?
I think it's helpful. I'm not knocking new board members, but when you become a new board member, you have no idea. When you get that call, you want to take care of it. You think, okay, I can handle it. And we all think that at the very beginning, which we're not supposed to. And this is where this comes, this is handy. But I agree with you where it should be in chapters. It should be superintendent chapter, one page, next chapter, board. So it's easy and not thumbing through all of this. Right? I think it's essential. We need it, but I think it should be more easier access.
And I'll say from my perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you use standard operating procedure, the way I understand that, the purpose of that is to tell you how something should be done, like how we operate in a specific situation. Is that accurate, or how would you?
It is. It's like, it depends, right? SOPs are meant to be guidelines. They're not meant to be prescriptive. They're not meant to be authoritative. They are a blueprint or a guideline for a situation. So if you have no idea what you're doing, you go to that SOP and you're like, okay, and you can go through and you kind of get a general idea because it ties in, and I'm gonna go back to the military perspective, right? It'll tie in what your joint publications say, what your Army publications say, your field manuals, your technical manuals. It gets all the way down into if you're patrolling, what does that fire team look like? What is the best composition of a five-man team and which weapons you should have in which position and what distance? If you don't know and you're a new squad leader, that is a great reference to be like, this is my baseline. And then depending on the situation you're in, you modify because that formation doesn't fit in Vietnam like it does in Iraq, right? Like there's things you have to change. If that's the intent of this as an SOP, is to be a baseline, then let's make it that. But that's not what this is. This is a list of rules of do's and don'ts and legal responsibilities. Like, it's
That's
not-
helpful. That's helpful for me. And I would say from the legal perspective and from why this is there, the purpose of this is a guide on how to operate in certain situations. It should be closer to the SOP, though some of it should be about rules, that this is how we have agreed that we are following, that we don't go outside the. But in the instance, so it should have these things like complaints from community members. And it should be a step-by-step guide on here's what you should
Yes,
think about and what you should do. If you receive a complaint from the media or a question, inquiry from the media, here is the step-by-step
Yes.
guide on what we as a board have agreed to do in that instance. Whereas instead of having to go to the TASB online server and try to figure out which local policy, if we have one, talks about how to respond to media, I have it right there in the document that I just know I pull up board operating procedures, I search media, or I search complaint, and I see the steps that we have outlined as a board, is the purpose generally of board operating procedures. That you can hand to a new person, if they read nothing else, they read that, they have an idea of how this board has determined to function.
Yeah, and that I can get on board with.
Okay,
Yes.
awesome. All right, so it sounds like we are okay with reordering to those specific areas, kind of taking the language that you have it as is, putting it in those different buckets, and then you all can review that language at that time to determine if those procedures still fit. So now I'm going to move on to the other two policies we have here. The first one is on page 8. Nope, sorry, on 7. There's we talked a lot about page 6. Now we're on page 7. A lot of comments, a lot of them aligned with the same thing about either deleting something that's redundant or adding a section. The one I actually want to spend some time talking about here, and I think we've talked a little bit about this, and you all have talked about it in previous board meetings, is committees. You have one policy, BDB local, that talks about committees. It is a very short policy, which I don't think is necessarily bad. What we have talked about before is oftentimes there is a natural proclivity of boards to move towards having more and more committees that go more and more into the role of the superintendent. We're going to have a curriculum committee. We're going to have a school operations committee. We're going to have a transportation committee, et cetera. Oftentimes, those become a huge burden of time and energy that the superintendent and team have to spend dealing with board committees as opposed to actually doing the work. So I actually think the way you have your committee policy set here is pretty clear. You have just one type of committee, and it is a broad special committee that you can call at any point in time to do work for the board. And it's rather than the board coming together as a full workshop, you all can come together as a smaller group. You specify, I think appropriately, that it is, these committees don't have any decision-making power on their own. They share their findings back with the whole board, and the board can make the decision. And that the board, that they should be dissolved upon completion. I think this is a really strong policy generally, because oftentimes once you start a committee, it stays forever until you kind of relook at it down the line. my recommendations to this policy, and I'm curious about what you think. So the way you have this written, the way I read this is, you don't have any standing committees that every year you have. They are created to fill specific assignments unless otherwise purported by board action. My only recommendations here is that you have a set expiration on committees that do this. Committees should be either reauthorized every year or expire at the end of 1 year if they haven't completed their task, and the board has to determine if it's still necessary. And then the last comment here is around making sure that any committees that are created by the board are there to fulfill board tasks rather than administrative tasks. And I think the best guideline on what that is could this committee achieve its task even if nobody from administration showed up? If the board said, we're going to have a committee on the superintendent evaluation, we're going to decide the superintendent evaluation process. A board committee could probably do that. Superintendent would probably want to be there, but they don't have to be there. But if the board says, we want to have a curriculum committee, a board committee can't do that without the superintendent and his team being there to tell you everything they're doing about curriculum. That suggests that it is a superintendent task that the board has created a committee for. So my two big recommendations here is, number one, have some timeline at which a committee would expire unless otherwise reauthorized by the board. And number two, just specify that the purpose of board committees is to do board work predominantly. And if the superintendent, you could even add some language about a superintendent committee. Superintendent might say, I need a committee of board members to give me insight on how the community is going to receive this new curriculum. Perfectly fine, but that should be a superintendent committee, not necessarily a board committee. And the difference being who controls the agenda, who calls the meeting, who decides what to do. So let me pause there on committees and see if anyone has any thoughts to either of the suggestions or this policy generally.
So just a point of clarification, the title of this being Board Internal Organization, Internal Committees, that's referencing in our current construct, things like policy, finance, human resources, that board members sit on. Those are the committees we're referring to.
Yes, I think in practice. I think in true practice, all of those committees are outside, don't actually fit in this policy because there's no specialized tasks that they're trying to do. They just continue to exist. So I actually think those aren't adhering to your policy as you currently have it written. But the purpose would be if we have an HR committee, what is the purpose of that HR committee? Let's be specific about what that committee is expected to do, and when they're done doing that, it dissolves.
And so,
I think this policy here applies to example, the FOAC, the BAC, the Budget Advisory Council, and I think we're very good about
Creating those.
well,
Purpose.
the formality and the purpose and the structure around those committees, because they're all for a specific purpose. There's, definitely an intended timeline. There's, the composition, whatever. It's everything that this policy states is followed exactly in all those committees. Now, what doesn't align here is all the board committees, which
and so that was my point. The text of the policy,
Yeah.
if we're talking the Budget Advisory Committee, we're talking FOAC, we're talking the Benefits Committee, the text of the policy, we're matching it to a T.
Right.
The title of the policy, that is not a board internal organization. So we're already in conflict with what we're doing. Now, I don't know, Mr. Mackey, how privy you were to it, but the last board meeting, we voted to do away with the internal committees and move more towards a workshop style setting. So I think that will help alleviate some of the consternation here, but I definitely think there needs to be an update. If nothing else in BDB local title to special function committees or whatever you want to call it. So it's not board member centric, it's community and staff.
Yeah. So I forget what the letters were, but we eliminated or did away with that policy through board action last month.
Yeah, you did actually. So
Yeah.
this is actually outdated from your current policy that you adopted late last year.
Yes.
But I think the question still stands. So what you currently have, so this has been adjusted, this is an older one from when we did this originally, is that board committees are formed by board action and shall specify all the things about it. It has the same language about fact funding, deliberate, et cetera, shall not assume responsibility. but it's still, I think what you currently have in your policy is that once you create a board committee, it's there until the board dissolves the committee. So you have a policy that creates perpetual committees. Has the board taken any action to create any committees based on its new policy yet?
This is actually, the title is wrong. This is the policy issued 11/7/2006. And so the current, both legal and local, is board internal organization. So that's just the section, and the title is board committees, period. And it is update 125, issued 6/6/25. So it's, and the structure of the policy, I mean, the purpose, whatever, is pretty much the same still, but the name
Yeah, the name
is
has been changed.
different. So the conflict doesn't exist anymore between what the policy is saying and what the title
Yeah, and I
says.
think it's just a language clarification piece, right? Where we want to be able to, and I think to Ben's point, we want to be able to create special committees at the request of the CFO because he wants community input on the budget.
Right.
Leaving it open-ended, I think is a poor life choice. I don't know if it needs to necessarily be in policy per se, or maybe we need to edit it, but, hey, maybe it's, for no greater than 6 months without extension, or 1 year, or there's an automatic sunset. Like, if nothing else, it automatically sunsets, 12 months, from the time of creation, like whatever that is, so that we don't have 15 committees on the books and only 3 of them meet. I think if it's for a specific time, purpose, and scope, then we set it up and close it down.
So
Right.
BDB is board committees, which is subcommittees of the 7 of us. So let's say we wanted to have a committee to rewrite or update the BOPs. So, okay, that would be, a subgroup of us here doing the work to get it and then bringing it to the board. Same thing for the superintendent's evaluation. The policy itself says that if we're talking about advisory committees that include staff, parents, community members, that's BDF.
Yeah. So you have these two separated out. I think the question still stands on the subcommittees of this board.
Right.
My recommendation would be that you don't have perpetual committees, that when you create a committee, you give it a specific charge, and then it should sunset after some amount of time, unless reauthorized. If you choose to reauthorize it, that's your prerogative. Does anyone have any concerns about having
No.
a sunset after 6 months or a year or on completion?
And I think that would be a good practice too. If in the creation of the committee, we do not have the target dissolution date, then that at the end of the year, it would just automatically dissolve. And we're stepping in that, as far as the existing committees, we're stepping in that direction because we're doing away with them. But those were perpetual committees.
Yeah, I think the long-standing committees are a good thing to move away from. I think still having the ability to create kind of a new task force where it's like, hey, look, Chip, Alice, and Maryville are going to tackle this situation, and we're going to bring in, Melissa and David to do it with them.
Right.
And then they can bring it back to the superintendent and board. I think that's key to be able to keep.
Makes sense to me.
Okay,
I agree.
that makes a lot of sense. We can also add, if it makes sense, just the note that superintendent might see a need for a committee. Superintendent can always create a committee that's comprised of board members or otherwise. They might say, you know what, we're thinking about going back out for another TRE or a VEDA or a bond or something like that. We want to have people. Superintendent can always create that. That shouldn't be construed to mean that you can't do it except for this process. Those are separate committees from board created. Great. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns on this? All right. Huh? All right. So we will now move on to the last large area here, which is around board meetings. So this is actually, starts on page 9. You have your area about board meetings and agendas. This is your BE local policy. You also have that one with a lot of notes here. I'm going to first start off with a broad question. You all know your procedures for setting the agenda, when you get your information, when you get the packet, when you're asked to take votes, et cetera. I'm just going to open up broadly and just see, you know how you function currently as far as a board and your meetings and your agenda and getting the information and making decisions. Is there any things that you either really think work well or you wish we could think about how to improve those processes as it relates to the scheduling, the agendizing, the getting the information, the asking questions, and voting in any given board meeting? So I'll ask it broadly first, just to see if anyone has any thoughts. We have veteran trustees all the way to newer trustees on this. I'm curious. And that also goes to you, Superintendent. If there's things that are difficult for you and your team, would love your feedback.
Okay.
I think now that we've stepped on the path to move away from the committees and have, one workshop and then the regular board meeting so that we all see the information, we all have the opportunity to ask questions and to listen to questions that maybe we did not think of. What was I thinking? Some of that is an improvement, a definite improvement, because it makes sure that we're all on the same page. But also, it's more efficient use of staff resources. By far more efficient. I think the only thing, and I don't remember if it's itemized here or not, but the one, and it's not a concern now, but we used to, until fairly recently, if a board member wanted to add something to the agenda, they had to gain the support of at least 2 other board members. So it required 3 for someone to get something on the agenda. And at some point, we reduced that to 1 person. So it hasn't been an issue at all. But at some point, I think our agenda was just getting loaded with things that were not board work. And since since all it took was a single board member, there was no way to set up guardrails around that. I happen to think that if you can't get 2 other individuals to support that something is important enough for the board to consider it, then it shouldn't be considered. Sir?
Because we're moving away from committees the week prior and moving more towards a board workshop construct where we'll see how this plays out, right? But we meet a week or 2 before the board meeting. We have a 4-hour meeting of all the stuff that we go over in committees. Is it possible to, on the agenda for that board workshop, put requested agenda items for the next board meeting, and we leave it open for discussion? Where it's like, hey, I had this idea about, can we talk about it at the next board meeting? And then we have an open discussion about it in our workshop.
And with that, we wouldn't need the executive committee. That also would go away because collectively, we would be making those decisions of what truly our agenda is for the official board meeting that we're having for items to be approved, the board work. Because before we had the executive committee that we would review, so on and so forth. I mean, truly, what I'm hearing
Have you not been
is-
purview to the executive committee? I love the fact that you guys do that, and then we see the agenda. If the workshop gives you an 80% solution, I still appreciate the executive committee, especially as a group of leaders and seniors, looking at that going, consent agenda, no, we need to talk about this. Because you know the impacts more than I think we would. I don't know how that plays out in practicality, but I appreciate that set of eyes and then expertise looking at the agenda. I think my piece is more going towards, so we don't overload the agenda for the regular meetings. If we put an agenda item in the workshop that says open discussion on future agenda items for whatever, that gives us the legal parameter to be like, hey, I wanted to bring up this thing and talk about it, right? And then if 6 people there tell me no, I'll be like, oh, I'm not going to waste the time in 2 weeks because nobody's going to vote for it anyways.
We'd have to be very, very careful, and we'd have to figure out with Mr. Blanco how we would go about that. And we would have to have the discipline of how we bring it up because, if
And I'll save you the time. You can't do that because you can't put an open item to talk about anything you want to talk about and then come to a meeting and talk about it because people haven't been posted. So your lawyers will tell you you can't do that. And I actually don't think it's a great practice anyways, because again, what I would recommend if you want to do something like that is have 2 trustees individually or 3 trustees figure out what they feel like needs to be talked about and make the submission, and then you could post potential items for consideration. This thing, but that now you can actually talk about, okay.
So we turn it in before the workshop to talk about it at the workshop to determine if we want it at the regular agenda.
Exactly. I would make it, but I would still recommend highly that you have ideally 3 trustees, because again, to your point, if you're gonna, usually these things don't, one of 2 things are true. Either things are being put on the agenda just to talk about it and not actually do anything about it. I would ask, what's the purpose of talking about it if you're not actually gonna do something about it? But that's the first thing, is I hear a lot of people say like, I got a lot of complaints about this, so I wanna spend a board meeting time talking about this thing. That oftentimes, it just makes it a lot more sense to address the problem and have the superintendent address the problem, rather than to demand all the staff sit there for an hour as we have this conversation. I would be very tight about what you decide to spend time on. Every minute you spend of your meetings, not focused on your priorities, you're telling the staff, those priorities aren't our priorities. It's these other things. So I would be very hesitant to just have a big open thing of a lot of things to talk about. The second thing is, if it is a decision you're making, we need to talk about this because we need to do something different about our policy. Then I would say, why would you even consider it if you can't get 3 people? Because you'll never get 4 people to vote. So you should definitely still keep some sort of guardrail in there. Otherwise, what you will inevitably see, maybe not with this board, not today, but you will see more and more of your time being spent on whatever happens to be the topic of the day that the loudest people want to talk about. And what that inevitably says is that one person or those 2 people now are dominating all of the superintendent's time and all of their staff time, because that's what they're spending time on at the end of the day.
So not to belabor the point, but we're talking about an SOP. We're changing the way we're doing business. And so to make it more efficient, what are a couple of your recommendations for, 1, getting support without potentially having a walking quorum, or making it look like you're politicking behind closed doors to garner support before you bring it to the board? And 2, as we're looking at streamlining and making this process more efficient, are we able to have that conversation on what items we're no longer going to bring to the board for a regular agenda item because it's superintendent work and not board work, like personnel hires and et cetera, et cetera?
If I may, yeah, and those are some good points, and I think that's, my opinion, still then the purpose of the executive committee, where one of the trustees would bring it up to board president or one of the officers as to what, I would like to get this on the agenda. We still meet. It's a matter of figuring out what the cadence is going to look like in terms of executive committee, workshop, board meeting. That's something that we're working on administratively, is to come up with a format to present to you all, to get your thoughts on it. Because last thing we want to do is have everything on the agenda at both meetings. So that one of the things that we're working on now is to just look at sample of agendas and say, okay, what is board work and what's superintendent work, and bringing at the workshop what this is board work. So we're going to present to you these items for your consideration at next week's meeting, that type of thing. So it's just going to be a matter of coming up with a cadence and coming up with a format for the workshops themselves.
So Ben, when we had our committee meetings, when we're in CNI, on the agenda, it would say items going to the board. So everybody can look at the board package or look on the online and see which items are going to the board. So every board member already knows what's going to be on the agenda, basically, and they can figure it out. The executive team, all we basically do is discuss what's going on with the agenda. And I'm thinking too, like Maribel, like Ms. Macias, we already know. If I'm not part of the policy, but I could go online, see what's going to be on the agenda and policy, and I already know that's going to be on there. So all we do, we go to Mr. Vasquez, we go over the agenda and we discuss it. Okay, and then let's get some information. We already know about it. So do we need the executive team? The advantage, I guess, the important part is Mr. Vasquez has a concern and then he tells the executive team, this is something I want to talk to you guys about. And then we could have that separately, but every board member already knows how the agenda's going to, what the agenda's about.
Yeah.
We're going to be on the agenda, actually.
And I haven't heard the details, so I'm kind of reading between the lines and how you all are thinking about it. It sounds like it's a really meaningful step. Let me summarize what I understand, and you tell me if this is different. Is that there would inevitably, in legal policy, board president and superintendent have to work together to put the agenda together. Oftentimes, it is the superintendent recommending the agenda items and the board president signing off, yes, those are good, or no, you can't put that one on this month, et cetera. You all have the unique feature where you have an executive committee that does that instead of just the board president. It sounds like you can make a decision on if we still need all of those trustees in there, or is it just the president and the vice president, or is it just the president? We can talk about that in a second. So that agenda would be crafted and determined, would include all of these things that are like, would be items going to the board. And then you would have a workshop, probably and presumably in the earlier part of the month, where all of those items from the finance and the HR and the commit, like all the committees, all of those items that are coming to the board would be listed in your agenda. And the workshop would be to talk through each of those items. So here's our curriculum. Here's what we're going to ask you to adopt this new curriculum, and here's why we're doing it. And we're going to ask you to do this. We're going to ask you to do that. And you'll actually talk through and have a discussion, no votes, is what I understand a workshop to be, where you're actually getting clear on each of the items I'm going to be asked to vote on in a week or in 2 weeks. Is that accurate?
Yes.
That is accurate, and
Okay.
that way administration knows the questions that we have versus them getting it a
Yes.
cold call on the dais. And that way it
Yes.
helps them prepare us.
I think this is highly effective because essentially, and what you're also doing is giving yourself a week or 2 weeks to get more information. So superintendent and team aren't surprised at the night meeting, and you're not surprised at the night meeting when something gets changed. So I think given that, then my recommendation is whomever, whether it's executive committee, or you might not need it because you now have a workshop, that is, your executive committee has everybody at the workshop talking about these things, is the agenda gets released, any materials available by the time you, like the three days in advance of the meeting, like you normally do. Then you have your workshop, and the board can go through every single item and talk about all of those different things, ask questions, say, I'm gonna need this before I vote, I have a concern here, you've gotta help me feel better about this thing or that thing. You have those conversations, and then what I would presume happens is the superintendent and his team spend the next 2 weeks getting answers to those questions, reaching out to trustees, giving you the information that you asked for, et cetera. So when you come back at the night meeting, ideally, most, if not all of your questions on most things are answered, and maybe there's one or two items that you need to actually still talk about. Is that accurate?
Yes, and that should
Yes.
streamline the board meeting.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think that is an incredibly strong practice because you are getting information well in advance and the superintendent team is getting information well in advance. I think then as it relates to the question about how do we add other items, I think you just have a policy in here that you decide on. Is it 2 people or is it 3 people that can put something on the agenda? I think you do want to have some amount that says like, if 3 trustees feel it's strong enough and important enough for us to talk about, we can make the request and get it put on. I would just be specific about your timelines. From the moment that it is submitted, the board president has 30 days to put it on an agenda, as opposed to like, we have to do it right now, or we can surprise, because that just creates chaos. To the point about open meetings and walking quorum, not a lawyer, you should get legal advice from your counsel, but generally this is a very common practice in Texas. The reason it isn't a violation of open meetings is because there's no impending action by the board. Open meetings is around impending action that you're going to take. You can't have the discussion offline. You are just simply trying to get a discussion to happen about the item. And so you trying to say, hey, this is really important, we should consider doing X. I'm trying to get people to put that on the agenda so the board can have the discussion at that point.
So, also not a lawyer, but I have watched plenty of TV shows.
It makes you a liar.
Just saying. If I have an item that I would like to present to the board, and I call Chip, and I go, hey, Chip, I want to potentially put this on the agenda. I'm going to email it to you. Take a look. Tell me whether you support putting it on the agenda or not. Right? And he looks at it, and he sends me some edits, and he's like, yeah, I would support this. I'm like, hey, it makes sense. And then I do the same thing with Alice, and she's like, nope. And then I do the same thing with Maribel, and the minute I hit 4, I've now established a walking quorum. Because now there's a sense of whether they would support it, whether they wouldn't support it, what it looks like. And that's what I want to make sure that we prevent.
And my note
Right,
is,
and there was oh my gosh, I think Dee Margo was the mayor at the time, but the city ethics commission had a walking quorum violation during COVID, because there was an article that they're looking at putting out, and they sent it and sent it back and sent it and sent it back, and every single member of that commission had the opportunity to read it, make edits, and then it was published, right? And it was a violation, and the Attorney General got involved, and it was a whole to-do. So I just want to make sure that whatever process we decide on, hey, I need so many trustees to say we're going to put this on the agenda, that there's safeguards in place so that we don't break TOMA.
It would be my recommendation that regardless of what you decide for your board operating procedures, you should have your legal counsel look at it. All right, so it sounds like the workshop thing goes a long way. As far some of the other specific questions I had here, so on adding new items to the agenda, I would be curious on other people's thoughts. Usually what I see in the workshop, and you all, I think right now the way you have it in policy is executive committee decides what goes on consent or what doesn't go on consent. Is that more or less accurate? How do you all determine what goes on consent?
No, usually administration recommends.
Yeah.
I think what goes on consent or not comes from the committees. I know that at policy, we have conversations and we say, you know what, that one, there might be questions, you might want to put it on, or take it off consent. But those conversations usually for executive, those are had usually at each of the committee meetings. So therefore, whenever we meet as a committee or as a special, board meeting that we're gonna have, I think all of that you'll have the guidance
Yeah.
for that.
What I think because your policy is that the president decides what goes on consent or not. So it sounds like the committees are making that recommendation, the president is agreeing with that.
Or executive
Executive.
is agreeing
Executive,
with that,
right.
yeah.
My recommendation, and you can, again, decide, if you have a workshop structure where you are gonna go through every single item that you wanna talk about, rather than where it's difficult if someone is trying to decide what fits or what doesn't, you place your president or your executive committee or your superintendent in a difficult position if they're having to make calls. My recommendation, if you have a workshop agenda where you see everything and talk about everything, is that put a process in place that essentially everything we talk about that we received at that workshop, everything we talked about there starts on consent for the night meeting. And then build a process that two trustees
other
can say, we still have concerns here. We want to pull that one off to spend more time talking about it. Have a 2 or 3 limit to pull things off.
Yeah.
That way it eliminates people having to decide, like, should it be on consent or not? You
Start
talked
it
about
there.
everything. Now everything goes to consent, and trustees have until the night before or 2 nights before to say, well, here are the items I still have concerns about, and pulling it off. And that gives the superintendent time to say, okay, it's these 3 items that there are still questions about. My team and I will prepare on those items to be much more prepared to go in depth with those. So that might be a recommendation I would have with regards to.
It's a good idea.
consent agenda. Okay. I also think, I will leave this on, it sounds like you have, and the other side of that is anything that is not at the workshop, so like a week after we go, oh dang, we need to make this purchase, we didn't put the purchase on there, things happen. My recommendation is if something is not on the workshop agenda, it should never go on consent. It should come on as a new item because that's the first time the board is seeing that new item. And there's always those things like emergency or
Yeah.
whatnot, but
Right.
if the benefit here is if you get it in early, it can stay on consent unless there's questions about it. But if it's something that's last minute, the board, it should never be a surprise on consent that sneaks through. That works
I
for you.
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. The last question around this is, do you all, would you want to put in any specifics around like timelines for question asking and answers? So it sounds like you'll get all your information before the workshop, and then you'll have a workshop where you'll parse through it. Then you have 2 more weeks or 1 more week or whatever it is to review all of that. Inevitably, questions will come up again afterwards. You thought about it at night on the drive home and you came up with a question. Do you want to have some sort of structure that is like, you know what, after the workshop, trustees should, over the next week, send any additional follow-up questions to the superintendent? And if you have a process where you send questions in earlier, you can also expect the superintendent and their team to answer the questions before you get to the night meeting. But if you don't, then it's a surprise and everyone's kind of like figuring it out at the night meeting.
Yeah.
So that would be a question for me, is I don't know if you've talked about the time frame between the workshop and the meeting, and if you want to have something that says like, the first 7 days after the board workshop, board members should ask all their questions, and then in the next week, 2 days before the night meeting, the superintendent will provide written answers to all the questions that were asked to all trustees. or something like that. That's-
Yeah, and I think ideally, just what we've been talking a little bit about is having the workshop the Wednesday before the regular board meeting, and then any questions that come up, we would get a written response by that Friday to include in the Friday
That's awesome.
packet. Or any questions that come up after the meeting, they can ask those and we can respond by that Friday.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make it too restrictive where now I can't ask a question because we said no questions after this date and then, right? Like, so I don't want to
Yeah.
make
Yeah,
it too
to be-
restrictive, but on the flip side, I don't want to send Selena Stiles 12 questions 3 hours before the meeting.
Yeah.
Right,
So
and I will,
it's-
answer for, yes, nothing you do here will restrict a trustee from ever asking, you ask all the questions you want, that's your job. What I think the specificity is here is if you ask the question before a certain time, then you can expect a written response to the question. Whereas you ask it afterwards, you can't guarantee that the superintendent and his team are gonna get you a written response, you just have to wait for the meeting for it. But I can also, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I will speak for every superintendent I've ever known, every superintendent would rather have your question early, no matter when it is. Even if it's right before the meeting, give me the question now, so I can tell my team to start thinking about it, so they're not surprised in the day. Okay, that's helpful context. That makes a lot of sense.
Ben, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is there still room to talk about getting items on the agenda?
Yeah.
Because I didn't get a chance to kind of really voice what I was thinking about when we were having that discussion.
Ben.
Huh? Can you guys hear me better now?
Here we go.
Yes.
Cool. Just wanted to make sure to voice my preference about having 3 board members, to be able to get something on the agenda. I think that for me, there's a lot of work that's taking place already behind the scenes, and I agree with you in terms of getting with our legal counsel and determining the guardrails to be able to avoid situations like the ones that Mr. Woodcraft outlined while he was talking, or while he was outlining that particular situation at the city of El Paso. But for me, one of the things that I think about is don't bring a vote to the floor if there's not a likelihood of it making it across the finish line. I think our and I've talked about it with Jim before in the past. Our time is very valuable, and we do have a lot of discussions about quite literally issues that impact tens of thousands of individuals. And so for me, it's if something comes before us for consideration, you've better done the work to make sure that it is probable for it to get across the finish line. Without violating quorum. And
Right.
of course, I think 3 individuals, and it's likely that maybe a 4th one will kind of jump on. That's just my thought process. And I think that it's a really great way of weeding out things that maybe are not necessarily worth discussing, but why discuss them if there's a very slim chance that it won't and then that way we can kind of, entertain discussions on other items. That's just kind of all that I wanted to say on
No, that's super helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
And I'm glad the way that you summarized that, because truly, in the past, it was more of a soapbox. It was on there, and truly, there was not the support, but it was a soapbox item, which we don't have time to focus on. We need to focus on our students and our data. So I think that's the perfect way that you summarized it.
Correct.
And as a former administrator, I can tell you what I spent time on. I wish I could tell you it was on student learning, but it wasn't. It was on whatever the board was gonna spend a lot of time on. That is what I spent time on that week. So it's to keep the focus on what you have said is the most important things through your actions, through monitoring your progress, through having these conversations with your superintendent about your progress towards your goals and your constraints and all of that. And yes, you need to have these other conversations when they're meaningful, but you should make them, as you mentioned here, it should be a meaningful conversation with the board that we need to take action on, or maybe not, but it was at least, there's more than one person that wants to.
And maybe it
Oftentimes
should be,
it becomes-
maybe we should turn to policy, because we never had that issue before. Just recently, past couple of years, we've had that. It was more of a soap opera. Before, it was streamlined.
Yep.
And maybe we should adopt a policy in case the board does change, which it will eventually.
That's my
It should have policy instead.
number one recommendation about all of this. You should adopt the policies for what you do in crises before the crises. You should do it when it's calm, so it helps you in those times. All right.
And if I can, Ben, I think that's maybe the purpose of this, is, does this board need this? No. Will a future board need this? Possibly.
I needed it.
The last item I had on this, on the board meetings, do you all, I don't believe currently you have, and maybe you don't need this, and maybe this is usually for larger boards, but it probably might have been a problem in the past. Do you all have a time limit on how long each trustee can speak on any particular item, or how many rounds that is?
No, sir. There's no time limit.
My recommendation is usually best to have some limit, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and do multiple rounds of that. Because otherwise what could happen is one person dominates the conversation and talks for as long as they want to, and there's really not much you can do unless it's in your policy. So what I usually see is having some limit that's reasonable to ask your questions, have a conversation, 3, 5, 10 minutes, and you have some language around that. Every trustee should get a chance to speak and ask their questions first before we go back to anybody again. And having some limit on the number of times we do those rounds, just to have some cap, that again, it's not, if I'm a very passionate trustee talking for 30 minutes, like I don't feel singled out when you stop me because we actually have a policy around it. It's never binding. The board could always waive the policy and talk more about a critical item, but it's good to have a process like that. Would that be something the board was interested in?
So if there's one trustee that has a brevity problem, it's me. And I think
Your
that,
time starts now.
and I really appreciate Mr. Nahara's approach when we're on the dais, because he will look every trustee in the eye and make sure that you have had the opportunity to say what you needed to or ask future questions, and he does it numerous times. Will any future board president do that? I don't know, right? And so putting something in place isn't necessarily a terrible idea. But I also believe that there's enough mutual respect to not bogart time between the trustees on this board, where we may have a lot to say, but it's not going to be 30 minutes.
That's this board.
It's this board.
I think
So I don't think it's a bad idea to have something in place that would secure that.
And I liked your idea of, once you have your moment, you know that everybody else is gonna have their time before it's your turn again.
Yeah.
Because I know that that was a contentious
Before.
time, and it was uncomfortable. And that way, if it's written, even though, again, sometimes we don't have enough teeth to implement, but it's written. And that way, it could be learned
I think
by
And I think
our new trustees.
Giving flexibility, right? Maybe most board meetings, we don't need that, but there's an item that comes up that we know is going to be contentious. Where we've got 250 people in an overflow room.
Right.
And then that's when the president of the board goes,
Reminder.
for this item, we're using this policy, right? And then that kind of sets the framework to make sure that emotions stay tepid.
Yeah. But the only thing we've done, Ben, is used Robert's Rule of Order with a motion to call a question. And, once that motion is made, if you get the second, here comes the vote. Discussion's over. So,
Another
but,
way to control for it, for sure.
but I think it can be abrasive. And I like the approach of, and it was only in excess, like, okay, we've been talking about this item for like the last hour, and there's still 6 of us who haven't said a word. So I like the idea because, it does give a guideline, and if something contentious does come up, you can sit there and say, okay, as a reminder, we all get 5 minutes so that we can keep the meeting moving forward.
Ben, do you have examples of other school districts that have something like this?
Yeah.
Like which ones?
So I'll speak to a number of different ones. So in Dallas, each trustee gets 2 rounds of 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes. So on any item, each trustee gets up to 20 minutes. Do we ever functionally use 20 minutes on every item? No. But it is, so, we'll start with someone, they get called, but if that person reaches their first 10-minute limit, then the president says, okay, now we got to stop and move on to the next trustee. Okay, nobody else in this first round? Well, then we can go back to the second round, and you can start your second round. By the end of the second round, are we ready to make our vote? If not, the board would have to vote to waive the policy and then could talk about it more, which happens sometimes. I see other boards that have 3 minutes, and it's one round of 3 minutes because you should have done your homework, everyone. You should know how to vote. This isn't about pontificating, it's about action. Like, I've seen boards do it that way also. Again, no right way to do it. I think there's just different ways to set that up.
And with our new workshop, we should be at that point by the time we get to our meeting.
Yeah. You're giving yourself the opportunity to talk about every single item,
Right.
on consent or not, well before, so. But again, I think you all could decide what starts and then make some adjustments there. All right, y'all, that's a lot on board operating procedures. What my next steps will do, if you all have more to say, please feel free. The next steps here are, I'll send these back out to you. If you have additional thoughts or areas you think should change, please send them to me directly. What I will now do is take this and redline and reorganize it into a draft based on what I heard here tonight. If I make any mistakes or transcribe something wrong, chalk it up to my head and not my heart. But then I'll turn that back around to you all at a future meeting and or workshop. And at that point, now you will look through each of the wording and make sure the wording reflects what you want it to do, or make other adjustments, or say, hey, actually, we had that in there about complaints. I don't think that's right anymore. I think we need to change it. And at that point, you will just move it through like a regular policy and decide what you want to do with it going forward. You'll ask your lawyers to review it to make sure that it controls for open meetings, et cetera. Any questions there? Yes?
Yeah, going back to the previous discussion that we were having on time, the enforcers of that is typically, would be the board president, or would it be?
Yep, only the board can police itself. So the board, and usually what operating procedures have, and I think you actually had a few bullet points in here around it, is like, what happens when people aren't following the operating procedures? Legally,
Yeah.
there's not a ton you can do, but it's things like conversations, or at the most extreme, it's reading a censure notification or taking away privileges, et cetera.
So then, would you say that, is it fair to say that this document, the enforcers of this document are us?
Yes.
As board members?
Yes.
It just depends on how how much we use it and how much we decide to enforce it.
Yep. 100%.
And what I value about it is that it's written, and that way it's not personal. It's something that we all agreed upon, and that way it's not personal, and that way it's documented. So when we do have to have those conversations, we could objectively just say, okay, we all agreed on this friendly reminder.
Doesn't mean you can tackle me in the parking lot, Manny, okay?
I am a natural contrarian. So if you tell me I will do something, my initial response is, no, I'm not. So I would appreciate it if some of the language was softened into recommendations. Hey, here's things board members are encouraged to do. Go to campuses when you're invited. Take part in some of these things. You know, some items board members should refrain from. Berating staff members, right? Or, you know, just some common decorum. But some of these in here are very legalese, where board members will, you will not, right? And I look at that and I'm automatically defiant. And I know it's a me problem, not a we problem, but that's immediately where my brain goes to. I still have some consternation that we vote on this. I don't understand why. Why are we voting on it? Like, this is something you could just issue as the board president and be like, here we go, right? We did this. We came together collaboratively. Here it is. I don't know that we need to vote on it. Probably going forward.
I'll tell you why you need to, is because this is considered a policy, and the board votes on policies. It's a compilation of all of your different policies in there, because
So I would push back a little bit, because all of the policies we've already voted on and approved, and this is just summarizing them in a different format, minus some decorum things that we have talked about how we're going to operate. I don't think decorum is necessarily a policy. It's just how we've agreed to do business. And that kind of goes back to the definition of what an SOP is versus what this is currently being utilized as.
If I recall, I think it's a requirement that we adopt our board operating procedures.
By who? Is it a legal
I
requirement?
believe it is.
I believe it is.
Like, if we
yes.
don't vote on this and adopt it, we're in breach of some state law.
Correct. So the board operating procedure has to be adopted.
I would be interested to read that one.
Yeah, I'll find it, because that's why we brought it to begin with. But then we added the acknowledgement to abide by it, and that was just a verbal acknowledgement to abide by it, basically to encourage, if there's something in there that you don't agree with, then let's discuss it. But it doesn't mean, that we should ignore it. Let's address whatever the concern is, and let's get a board operating procedure that we can, all agree, not just to adopt, but actually that it's meaningful, that it's something that we can,
And I think where we're contradicting ourselves in there is at the very end, we say these procedures are a voluntary agreement. Like it's voluntary. I don't have to agree to it.
yeah,
It is
some
my
of them in.
Yeah, this is my strong recommendation that that be removed also, because the point of an operating procedure is an explicit agreement amongst this board about how we operate. And again, it's the board. It's
Right.
not a consensus that it has to be unanimous. It is a quorum of this board has determined that this is how we operate, and that's what we're beholden to.
Yeah, and I think if you look back, Mr. Woodcraft, the date of adoption is 2005. It's a very different board. It was a very different environment. There was very different personalities at the time,
We
and
just
so
went
I
a couple
think,
of rounds of those.
yeah, and that's why I think it is maybe sometimes very, very, just very harsh. I think it's you will, and so
And I can appreciate the spirit and the intent of it, right? But like, if I'm going to go on the record to vote yay or nay, then that means I agree with it or I disagree with it. And as it stands today, like with no changes, I would probably abstain from this vote every single time it comes up. I don't take oaths unless they're legally required and binding. I don't subscribe to pledges and creeds, and the school board member's creed is in here. I'm not beholden to that. So if I say yes, then that means that I subscribe to this creed, and I may not, right? And so just out of principle, I typically avoid those things. That if I'm not going to put wet ink on and say, yep, 100%. At least with an abstention, right? If that's something that everybody else wants to do, and I take an issue with 3 things in here, I'm like, I don't want to be the naysayer. So if it's going to be a true SOP, where it's a guideline, and it's not prescriptive, it's not authoritative, and we're going to police ourselves, then that's a different conversation. But the way that it's written now, it's very prescriptive. I'm not a fan of that because it doesn't leave flexibility.
So just 2 thoughts. It sounds like there's going to be a lot of changes to this, so I think a lot of that will change. At the end of the day, it identifies what you all are defining in your local policies and in legal policies about how you have determined to operate as a collective board. That's not to presume that every single individual agrees with every single individual part of that. That's not the purpose. I mean, that's why each of you have the ability to vote no on anything you decide to vote no on. If you don't agree that the priorities are the priorities of the district, you could have voted no on that same thing. But it doesn't make that true for you and nobody else in that instance. The board has still adopted that, and you choosing not to operate in that way is you operating outside of the bounds of what the board has agreed on. And there's consequences that come with that, and there are things that don't matter that come with that, et cetera. So I think ultimately that's how to think about this is how the board is determining to operate together. Some of those are prescriptive, some of them are suggestions, and some of them, they might be prescriptive, but there's no repercussions except what the board chooses to do. And so that just is what it is. But in that instance, I understand that fully. It's like every other vote you take. You can choose to, I will only vote on things that I agree that it is exactly how I want it. I don't know of a single budget that's ever been adopted that I agree with absolutely everything on how I want it. And I also don't see a lot of people voting no just because they don't agree with one thing or abstaining every time a budget comes up. So I think that's really what an individual choice you'll have to make eventually on each of these is, this is a guideline for how we operate together. And the purpose of it is to be as clear as possible and as easy as possible for someone to look at in one place, as opposed to have to sort through the different policies for it. And, it's a living document. You all get to change it ongoing as it goes forward.
I have a couple of other things. So I liked what my colleagues mentioned earlier about not this board, but future boards. I think that that's very important for us to think about as we preserve the long-term success of this school district. In the case, then, of a split board, and the majority chooses to not kind of abide by this document or just completely ignore it, do you see serious consequences to that?
Yes, I see two kinds, one more important than the other. By boards choosing to ignore their operating procedures, there are punitive consequences, which I think are the least meaningful. They are if the board chooses to censure or take any action against other individual board members. Functionally, I don't think those matter in any way, shape, and form. The real cost is the cost to all the students and staff in the district. When boards choose to operate, focus on what they feel that each individual board member wants to focus on without reference to the greater good of the priorities, systems devolve, people leave, there are issues, finances get forgotten about, students get forgotten about. I think that's one of the most, unfortunately, consistent truths in U.S. education writ large. So as far as the consequences from a punitive perspective, I think that's less meaningful.
Yeah.
I think it's most important that this team of 8 figure out how to function with one another despite very different perspectives and backgrounds and different votes and different ideas. But if you can come together, and that's the purpose of these, is to kind of lay out what this looks like and how we choose to operate. Again, there's not going to answer to every single situation, to your point, Trustee Woodcraft, but it should give you a guide that when there's a complaint, this is generally what I should follow, and then this one's a little bit off for whatever reason, let me see what I can do to adjust it, keeping this in mind. Was that responsive to your question?
No, yeah, and I just think about it in the sense of, in the case, right? Because it is very probable, where this is just kind of just disregarded and. But other than that, I mean, is there a remedy, I think, right now that we can maybe implement to avoid that, or it's just kind of like, well, if a majority of the board chooses not to, then they choose not to.
I wish I could give you a good answer, but if a majority of the board chooses to totally ignore everything, majorities of boards can do pretty much everything they want until they are officially sanctioned by the state. So yeah, boards can choose to do make all kinds of terrible decisions as they so choose for their systems. That's local control. So yeah, I mean, it's.
And I think that was my main question, the main purpose of my question, to identify methods to safeguard this and to proof it.
And that's what essentially you are doing, is not making decisions for this board, but about how you would want any future boards to operate going forward. Doesn't mean they couldn't change these. They could obviously pick these up and change their policies. The best predictor of how a board will operate is how the board has operated.
Yeah.
And so if you all set systems that stay in place, it's much harder to change those systems. So they're not foolproof, but by simply actually putting in place the positions that you don't need today, that they might need somewhere down the line, it creates this expectation both for the board about how we operate, so it's a lot harder to change that, but also what your community expects when they actually turn into a board meeting or see how it operates. Or if you set these positions up like, oh, I know that if I ask, let's just take an example. If you have a policy that allows for any one trustee to put anything on the agenda, and then you have one very passionate community member who's best friends with a trustee, they are now learning to expect that when I'm passionate about something, I tell my trustee and they put it on the agenda. That is now a community expectation. And I feel like if someone else is a different trustee and they don't put it on the agenda, well, then there's differing expectations in your community. But if the board says the way we do it is, I might agree with you, I need 3 other people. So you, community member, you're passionate about this, go get 2 other trustees to think that they want to put it on the agenda. It creates this different community expectation that you're putting out there, if the board follows it.
Yeah.
And I think you made the mention, and I would summarize this as culture is king, right? And our culture within the team of 8 is going to supersede anything that this tells us anyways. And if somebody gets out of line with the culture, regardless of what this says, we're going to self-correct that. But that's this team, right? And so, like, I can appreciate setting things up for future success, but I think more than what we put in this and vote to adopt or not, it's when new members come in and older members rotate out, it's do we assimilate them to the culture of who we are and not change to who they are, right? And I think that's going to be the true test on whether this or any other policy survives.
Yep. All right. Great conversation. Anything else? Any other final words here on board operating procedures? All right, we have dove in very deeply to 3 topics very mightily, so thank you all for that. Given that it is well over 3 hours, it's your choice, but we can always take the you're gonna begin monitoring progress towards the goals and guardrails that you adopted. I believe this month is the
Yes.
first time you'll get one of these reports. We could also, there's a little bit of training discussion that I'd love to have before you actually engage in that conversation and think about why it's important. My recommendation, I'll leave it to you, we could do it now if you all want to stay a little bit longer and do it, or we can put it on the board meeting for 30 minutes before the monitoring session or do it another time. But I'll leave that open to the board.
I'm open to stay. I'm already here.
I'm open to stay too.
All right.
Here.
Should take about 20, 25 minutes, I would think. All right. So then we'll move on to the last one, which is around how to think about monitoring. So just to kind of
Mr.
reorient
Mackey,
everyone, you have a
You get 2 cycles of 10 minutes apiece, okay?
We'll see. We'll see how much y'all want to talk.
That's my president.
We have about 5 pages on what is effective goal monitoring. We're going to do a little bit of partner work. What I would love for you to do, the first 2 pages are about what is goal monitoring and what to do before goal monitoring. So I'm going to ask, I'll have the 2 people you're next to, so Charles and Alice, Maribel and Jimmy, Michael and Paul, and Ryan and Manny. If you'll read the front and back of the first page, what is goal monitoring and before goal monitoring, take about 2-3 minutes, read all of that, and then have a conversation with your partner about things that stood out to you on those 2 pages. Again, just the front and back of the first page, and as you finish that up, go ahead and start talking to your neighbor about areas that stood out, questions you might have.
Excuse me.
It's a good microphone.
It was.
It was.
So like,
Here's the data, this is what happened, these are the results. Period.
yeah, like culture is
don't-
king,
we
right? How
don't-
much time are we
We
gonna
don't
spend?
talk about,
50%, how often are we gonna monitor it?
oh, and we lead by
Consistent.
example, so what they see.
Constant.
And so if look at our finances. Yeah. Mhm. Exactly.
Obviously.
That's great. That's like, it's all different. But this part, yeah.
Did you present
Yeah,
our goals?
it's that feedback mechanism.
Talking about
Healthcare plan.
the
Yeah.
board.
Yeah, you don't need.
It's kind of our plan.
Even identifying what's
Working.
versus superintendent.
Not,
It's gonna be
maybe they're
a
working.
new training for all of us. So,
Without those feedback.
versus superintendent. Yeah,
How do we know?
right.
All right, go ahead and finish up your conversation. So let's start with the first page. What is goal monitoring and how goal monitoring is beneficial? Looking at just the front of the first page, what items did you circle or highlight or talk about that stood out to you when you talked with your partner? Who will be first to share?
Leaders do not pay attention to what's working and what's not working. We both highlighted that.
Say that again, sorry?
The leaders do not pay attention to what's working and what's not working
Point to where you are on the page.
on the top.
Yep. And why did that stand out to you?
I think we often look at what's not working and we don't see what is working and we focus on the negative, not the positive.
Yep. Any other thoughts?
I think sometimes as leaders, we lose sight, we lose focus on what is important, and we end up focusing on things maybe that are more relevant and easier to understand. You know, so we're a school board, we should be focusing on student outcomes, but we all deal with budgets at home. We all deal with what we're gonna buy, what we're not gonna buy, that kind of stuff. So it's easier to spend time discussing or maybe sometimes even more comfortable to spend time about a contract and how much we're spending instead of what is the benefit that our students are getting from investing or choosing to invest in this specific resource versus something else.
And I thank you for illustrating that, and Charles, thanks for bringing this up, is oftentimes we might think, I pay attention to what's working and not working. But when you actually watch what we spend time on writ large across America in school boards, it's not about whether something is working or not working. Oftentimes, I don't even know if it is. I just know that it's this contract that I'm thinking about, and I think it's not gonna work, or I think it is gonna work, and that's why we're asking it. Instead of actually trying to truly understand, what are the results that I'm seeing? What are the strategies that are leading to those? And only after I truly understand that do I make decisions on how we're going to move. Oftentimes we just start with the how. This is what we're going to do. This is what we need to do. This is what we need to change, as opposed to really truly understanding what's the data telling me? Is it working? Is it not working? Why is it working? Why is it not working? And now, only after I know that, can I decide if I'm going to change something and why. Thank you for that. What else stood out on this page? Any other thoughts?
I think what we discussed was what you alluded to, that silver bullet. And that way, collectively as a team, we agree upon the data. And we're not relying on a silver bullet, and we're gonna give administration time, which was that second page. Give administration time to put in a very transparent system. And the other thing we discussed about was honesty. Again, like you said, that way, we're focusing on what's working, and if something's not working, being honest to adjust and giving administration time because it's very strategic of what they're doing and not expecting the silver bullet and, hey, you're new superintendent, we want it changed tomorrow.
Yeah, if there was a silver bullet that worked, some company would make a lot of money. And there's a lot of companies making a lot of money selling silver bullets that aren't actually silver bullets at all. So only if there was, we would have a lot better outcomes. But it's a lot harder than just one flip the switch. It's systems that you're dealing with.
I think along the same lines, we had talked on those first couple of paragraphs about what the feedback mechanism is. Are we getting the feedback on whether it's working or not? And I immediately went kind of to Michael's point about budgets and contracts. Not necessarily feedback on whether third grade reading is where we're at, but with the healthcare plan and the medical clinic, are those decisions that we made working or not? Is the staff satisfied or not? Is the budget impacts where we want it to be or not? But not having the feedback mechanisms in place to receive the feedback might be the biggest hindrance on revolving door, failing staff, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes it may just be, are the processes there to get us the feedback we need to adjust or make the right decisions?
What you will find is as soon as you start monitoring these things, whether on the goal side of the academics or on the healthcare side, is you'll very quickly realize, wow, there's a lot of growth that I can do to actually tie the hows to the outcomes. And you probably oftentimes need to find out, actually, I'm even missing the data systems. I need to build new data systems to understand if it's having the impact it's having. Thank you. Any other thoughts on this first page about why goal monitoring is important?
We talked about the second bullet, clarify strategies, and that the report should be at a 6th grade level. That just jumped out at me. But I understand why, because, if we're talking, in complex language and we're begin to dive into statistics and, things like that, then are we really understanding, thoroughly the strategies and what the outcomes are and how we're going to make the improvement? And even if we do, does everybody? And so if not everybody is on board, if not everybody, there's people excluded from knowing why it's important and what the plan is and what the expected outcome is going to be, and are we achieving the outcome, then we're not communicating, and it's just another, exercise in futility, because, we're just, might as well just be, talking with the mics off.
Yeah.
Nobody understands anyways, so.
Why else might it be important to have these reports in a really easily understandable, digestible way? Not to dive into all the acronyms we love in education, but say, we're on track, we're off track, and here's what we're doing about it. Why else might that be helpful for this board, the district, or the community?
Instead of wasting time trying to interpret the data, we're actually reading the data and making decisions based on it. So it's a better use of our time.
Yeah, that's one, is a lot of it. If you get a really complex report, you got to spend a lot of time sorting through it. You don't get to the actual conversation about, okay, we're on
Now
track.
what?
How are you expanding it? Or we're off track. What are we doing?
I would
Kenny?
say also it's the conversation piece of it all. It ensures that all parties are on the same page. And at the end of the day, I think it allows for us as trusted members of the community to be able to summarize what is it that was discussed and to discuss it in the most efficient way possible.
Yep.
I liked what you said, because we're all in it together, and what can we do to help? And if we understand, then we know I'm able to help in this way.
Communicating to the lowest common denominator is important. And sometimes I'll use the self-deprecating humor, and kudos to our finance team, because I tell them all the time, put it out in purple crayon for me. Because if I can understand it in purple crayon, then everybody watching at home can understand it too. And the entire finance team, like when we first came on and I started looking at some of the finance reports, I'm like, I see it, they're giving me all factual data, but I can't digest this. When they start moving to charts and graphs and side-by-side comparisons, I'm like, nah, we get it.
And if you can't digest it, signing up to do this volunteer every single month, you can't digest it. Who else can't digest it?
Right.
Literally everybody else in your community is trying to understand whether or not they should vote to do do a tax increase, or put a bond out, or send their kids here in the first place. And so the more that it speaks in simple language, you can then carry that out and share that more widely with the community who can parse the data in the same way you're doing, even if you're off track. Okay, but do we have a plan? Are we moving forward? Are we changing these things? The one I wanted to bring up here is the first bullet point, lead by example. What happens in the boardroom is more likely to be echoed in the classroom. Board behavior sets the culture for an institution. If board members want a culture where teachers are open and reflective in the class, they set the stage for demonstrating what that looks like for the board and superintendent to be open and reflective. Oftentimes, it's a very scary thing for a superintendent and their team to come up here and say, here's our third grade reading data. Some of it isn't great. How a board responds will change the entire dynamic of a conversation for the rest of your staff. If a board responds to that by saying, this is terrible, you're not even trying, like, here's what you should do instead, what is that going to result in the future? What might that result in?
Dishonesty.
Yeah, I think that type of transactional
clarity.
leadership is going to generate animosity and fear. And that you're not going to get the best effort or results from anybody, whether it's teachers or students, in that environment.
And if the opposite is, I see it, thank you for bringing this to us, how can we help? What are the next steps? How can we be of assistance? What would you see instead in assistance?
You would see that honesty and that transparency.
Yeah, you'd see it.
And, no, and the fact that they know that things aren't perfect and that we accept that, but that we're willing to help to provide them the resources to ensure that every child has what they need.
And in fact, what I've seen is it actually builds trust in the community. Your community knows that not everything is perfect all the time. No, that doesn't happen anywhere. But to have a conversation in a collaborative way, that will result in, yes, in the specificity here, Jimmy feeling much more confident to say, hey, we struggled here. We had these strategies, they didn't go as planned. We're making some adjustments and have a real conversation around that. In those instances, it's going to make his staff and principals more willing to have those conversations about what's not going right. And teachers more willing to have those conversations because we don't see a punitive response.
You don't want the board to finger point and
Yeah.
say, it's your fault.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The team, you all rise or fall together. I've never seen a board that can be successful without a superintendent, and superintendent can't be successful without the board. So. All right, on the second page, it was about monitoring calendars, of which you have adopted. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but did anything stand out about monitoring calendars? You all have adopted one as of last month, I believe.
I think Manny brought up a point that proactiveness here is key. And I tied that to two of the points that stood out to me, where frequency and predictability.
Why are frequency and predictability and consistency necessary?
When you create a rhythm and you know what's coming, you're better able to prepare and collect for it.
Yep.
When you're caught by surprise or last minute changes every time,
Yeah.
then chaos is now the culture, and that's not the culture we want to set.
Exactly. And one step further, and I've seen this in my own experiences, if you don't have a predictable cadence, then there's an inevitable feeling the superintendent brings reading data and it happens to be good. Well, then there's part of you that wonders, are you only bringing this to me because it's good and you want to show this to me now? And then on the other side of that, if a board member says, hey, I haven't seen reading data, I want to see reading data. Superintendent, are you trying to just get me on something? We don't, like, it doesn't make sense. But if it's predictable, nobody knows it, because we all know every April we look at reading data, how that's happening, and there's no home field advantage one way or the other. Thank you for raising it. Any other thoughts or reflections here? You all have this calendar. It's public. You all are going to start monitoring this month. That's awesome. This next page, ingredient 2, effective monitoring reports. I just want to highlight a couple things. This is the example that Lone Star Governance has. Yours may or may not look like this. But there are 4 key things that you should be looking for on a monitoring report. For any goal or guardrail or constraint or progress measure that you're looking at, number 1, the report should say what we're monitoring. This is about our TSI readiness, and we said we were going from X to Y. The number 2, it should have the data. It should just be clear. What we said we were going to go from 15% to 20%, where are we? Are we at 19? Are we at 25? What percentage are we at? The third thing is the interpretation. And this is the superintendent, and by extension, their team's interpretation of, do we feel like we're on track or not to meeting the goal? And you might sometimes see a lower score that looks off track, but the superintendent might say, yeah, we're actually on track because, we had, everybody showed up for testing and this and that happened. Or similarly, they might have a great score, but the superintendent says, hey, we're off track for this because our most vulnerable students didn't show up on testing day for whatever reason, or something like that. So there's always a little bit more than just the number, to our point earlier. You want the superintendent and their team's evaluation about, we feel like this is a good example of where we're at, or maybe it's not, and they can explain through that. And then lastly, probably the most important part is, what's the plan? What are we doing about it? We're on track, what are we expanding? We're off track, what are we doing? And if you're severely off track, again, that's not necessarily a problem, that's just reality sometimes. But the board should be thinking about, is the plan that the superintendent has sufficient to get us there? So if you're slightly off track, the superintendent might be looking for, the board, we're going to offer a little bit extra tutoring for students who are behind. That might make sense for a plan that's slightly off track. But if everybody's off track and they're like, we're going to keep on with the curriculum and do a little bit more tutoring, the board might say, is that actually going to move us to the level we need to? And that's kind of the conversation that should happen in those instances. Regardless of what your report actually looks like, those should be the 4 things that you should be looking for to try to get an understanding about what's happening. Any questions or thoughts or reactions on those 4?
I really like the simplicity of the green, yellow, red. And the fact that it very clearly says, we are slightly off track because, and then this is the plan. Black and white.
Yep. All right. I'll give you another 2 minutes if you flip to your next 2 pages. Ingredient 3 and ingredient 4, effective superintendent participation and effective board participation. Take a few minutes, read those, and talk to your partner about what stands out. As you finish, go ahead and talk with your partner. What stands out? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with?
I like that, yeah. Amen.
Make sure.
Go with the daddy. For me, it kind of all came down to like, be truthful and candid. It's bad data. Six other metrics. Now could be sure, but I think what that is kind of saying is don't create more things as needed. But, you know, but I think to your point, like being truthful, being candid. Sometimes it's hard to set conditions. That kind of ties into the back page for me. Is being prepared, being academic, not emotional. And then being predictable. Right? Like we're not the experts, but we are the students. And so as you get more prepared,
Go ahead and finish up your conversations. What stood out about effective superintendent or board member participation? Who would like to share either what stood out or any questions you might have? What stood out about either effective superintendent or board member participation and or any questions you might have?
I think one that ties both together, because I wrote them down on both pages, was be professional, not personal. Just across the board, good data, good feelings, bad feelings, like doesn't matter. Be professional, not personal. And I know sometimes it's hard to keep emotions out, but be professional.
Yeah, and what's
And
the
honest.
what's the cost if we get personal when there's? I mean, this happens more with bad data than good data. Let's be real, and it's natural to be disappointed when we have bad data. I haven't met any superintendent or any board member who is excited about bad data. So everyone's disappointed. But what is the cost to a system if a board chooses to get personal with regards to seeing and reviewing data that wasn't where we wanted it? What's the cost?
I think some of the biggest impacts is, right, and I'll be vulnerable for a minute, right? Like, for those of us that are married, right, refraining from using phrases like, well, you always do, or you always say, or you always spend, and it's not a shared responsibility. It's a blame game. And now what we're demeaning, what we're doing is we're demeaning the other person's professionalism, their skill, their craft, their expertise, their ability, their, like, you name it. And so by not being professional and pointing fingers and placing blame and being disrespectful is we're really tearing apart the fabric of the community that we need to be building up if tomorrow's leaders learning today is actually our vision.
Yep. So by blaming, we are creating divisions both on our board and in the community. What else? What are the other costs about getting personal and not professional?
I think that it opens up the opportunity for misinterpretation and miscommunication. And the intended goal is lost.
Yep. So we're now having a conversation about whose fault it is and having all this kind of miscommunications and not about what's the goal of monitoring? What's the purpose?
The
It's
board
up-
and
To create
the
a
board and
plan.
superintendent are arguing, it'll trickle down to staff.
Yeah, nothing's going to change. What's going to happen to, what's going to happen? What would any superintendent do if everyone's arguing at the superintendent? I'll look anywhere but Jimmy. You don't have to answer this one. What do y'all think would happen?
Shuts down and possibly leaves.
Absolutely.
They've been
Shuts down,
reevaluating everything.
gets defensive. Again, I don't know a superintendent who is trying to undermine their school system and not achieve. They're probably even more disappointed than any board member is on the outcome of that. But in those instances, what this oftentimes is, well, I'm not showing that data anymore. I'm going to find different ways. I'm going to avoid this. And now you lose you actually erode trust in those instances. Thank you for sharing that. What else stood out on these 2 pages?
One of the things that stood out to me is the importance of keeping the conversation going, because I think that it goes back to the previous section that we were talking about. You know, the more time that you spend on something, it really determines your priorities and you know, the significance of that. And so, you know, and I think what Maribel has said in the past, I know it's a common saying, but she says that a lot, and I agree with it. It's if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and a big part of that is keeping the conversation going.
Yep. Yeah. If it just stops and never leaves, then nothing changes. But if the board is continuing to talk about it, and you all have adopted a calendar that every 3 months you're going to be looking at reading or college readiness, et cetera, it continues that conversation and tells the system that this is not a one and done thing. Like, we need to. Thank you. Anything else stand out on these pages?
And have the difficult conversations. Don't, like it says, sugarcoating loses trust. And people can read the data. They know it's in front of them as well. So be honest, deal with it, and what's the plan?
Yeah.
Keep focused and talk about the plan. And it's okay to be disappointed and have those difficult conversations.
What I've seen over and over and over again is boards that get into the realness of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and are willing to share that with the community and aren't hiding from it and trying to hide it. Community's like, great, that makes sense. I knew that. I appreciate you telling me, and let's talk through it together. The last bullet point for board members, any thoughts on this? It says very clearly, don't offer advice.
Yeah.
Why? Isn't that your job? Why do we say don't offer advice?
Don't tell him how to do his job.
It's not our job.
Yeah. It's not your job. You only get one choice. You can either suggest how to do something, in which case you're responsible and you cannot hold the superintendent accountable, or you can choose to hold the superintendent accountable for doing it. And you get one of those 2 choices, you don't get both. And the reality is, it doesn't mean the superintendent's not going to ask your feedback about how might this impact? What should I think about? You might have a connection or an idea to, like, you know, create the opportunity, but ultimately realize that for someone who reports to you, your advice is indistinguishable for a command. Is he actually advising me to do that, or is he telling me I need to do that, wink, wink, or my evaluation is going to go down,
Right.
or something like that?
Right.
And so that is why we very clearly say don't offer advice where possible. Any other thoughts on these 2 pages? All right, we will go to the last 2 pages here. I'm going to walk through these about 2 things we'll think about. So you are going to get in January a report on the goals and progress measures. You're going to see the data. And then inevitably, you're going to have a really meaningful conversation about what that data is showing you. There are 2 things we're going to start with coaching around. The first one is around the type of questions you ask. You've all heard the thing, there's no dumb questions and all that. That's true. You should ask any question you have. But I will say some questions are more effective than others. And the purpose of monitoring is to understand and then know how the system is going to change because of the data they received. The data doesn't matter if you just look at the data and say, okay, cool, that's the data. It's about what you do with that information. That's why we specify to make it very short. It should be very actionable. We learn data, what are we doing about it? So the 3 types of questions that we'll talk about more and more is the first type is technical. These are understanding how something is measured. So for instance, if you're getting a report on ACT, a technical question might be something like, well, what sections does the ACT test on? That's science, reading, and math. How many students took this test? What grade levels do we give this test in? All of those are necessary for you to know. You should ask those questions, but they are technical. They are about how that test is and what it helps us try to measure and understand. The second type is tactical, so not about the test itself or the data I'm receiving, but how we have done something. How did you tell people that they need to take this and make sure that they know it's an important test? How did you train the teachers about what's going to be on the test. Those are about strategies that are being implemented, et cetera, about how we did something. And then strategic is about what did we learn and what are we doing about it. Strategic questions are by far the most valuable because they ask the superintendent and their team to talk about not just the data itself, but what are you doing with that data? So for instance, I'll give this answer. A very frequent question is, how many students of our seniors took this test? Superintendent's gonna respond, 490. Did that question tell you anything about how the district is changing based on the data? No. Still might be helpful to know. You should get that answer. But it's not gonna help the district do anything. Okay, a tactical question. How did you train our teachers to talk about ACT to their students? Does that change anything about how the district is doing this work? No, you got some more information, you learned a little bit more, it's a good thing to know. Doesn't change the district. A strategic question is how something aligns to the goals. So like, let's take one of these questions here. What I see at this school, the data's below the other ones. What didn't work there? Does that question have the potential to change how something is happening in the district? It does. And so we'll start talking, and this will be an ongoing conversation, is we're gonna ask you to start thinking about reflecting, what kind of questions am I asking? Oftentimes, questions are tactical and mostly tactical about how something was done, not about like what we're doing about it. And so we're gonna try to aim over time to get to more of the questions where you should be able to get these reports in advance. You can ask the technical questions. Hey, can someone explain to me what ACT is? What does it measure? What am I looking at here? You gotta get that information first. The best place to do that is in a one-on-one conversation or asking a question beforehand. And then when it comes to the board meeting, I know all of that. So now we can dive into what are we doing about what we see. And so that'll be one area that we will talk about and I'll have you reflect on as you ask questions. So again, no bad questions. There are just more meaningful questions that will elicit change faster than others. Questions about those type of questions. The other thing to differentiate is about current and future performance. Questions are either about what is currently happening and understanding what's happened to date, or they are about what we are doing next. And I will tell you, by far, most people want to ask about what's happening next. We go there first. But oftentimes we go fully to the future without actually understanding why something is the way it is. What strategies worked? Why didn't they work? Is it about what students we were targeting, or is it about how we trained the teachers, or is it about how we structured the classes, or is it about the curriculum? If you don't understand currently what's happening first, you can't make good decisions about what you're doing in the future. And so what we will also work at as we ask these questions, and it'll be fun to do this first one and just see what kind of questions people are asking about this, is to then reflect on how much time did you spend actually understanding the data you looked at and why it was the way it was? Because only after you understand the data and why it is the way it is and what the strategies were, then can you actually ask the best questions about what are we doing about it. Otherwise, what happens is we ask what are we doing about it, superintendent gives you an answer for what they think they're gonna do. Meanwhile, that may or may not actually be the reason. You might be focused on trying to get more kids into school because we thought attendance was it, when actually we didn't have the right curriculum in place or something like that. So those are the two things that we will reflect on as we do the monitoring about what types of questions we're asking and how much are we spending actually understanding what the report is telling me before I ask questions about what comes next. Any questions about those? All right. Well, that is what we will get to jump into in January, later this month, to talk about board monitoring. So I'm excited about it. I hope the team is excited about it. It'll be a fun journey, and that's what we will spend probably the most amount of time as we, like the big things to accomplish is y'all to finish up your policies and operating procedures. But after that, it's really just about getting more and more aligned on how we have monitoring and know what's happening with our goals. So, thank y'all. Any other questions on board monitoring, what to expect? All right, President, I'll kick it back to you.
Well, back to our agenda. Thank you, Mr. Mackey. With that, there's no further business before this board, so we are adjourned. The time is 8:53, and the date is Wednesday, January 7th, 2025. By the way,
2026.
20, I said 7, huh? Jumping ahead.
No, you said 25.
Oh, I said 25? Okay. Again, the date
Happy New
is Wednesday, January 7th, 2026. And I forgot to say, everybody, happy Board Recognition Month. To every single one of you. All right. All right, that's it. We're adjourned. Thank you.